Chapter 24 of A Distinguished Provincial at Paris by Honoré De Balzac. Translated by Ellen Marriage. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Bruce Peary. Chapter 24. For a month, Lucien's whole time was taken up with supper parties, dinner engagements, breakfasts, and evening parties. He was swept away by an irresistible current into a vortex of dissipation and easy work. He no longer thought of the future. The power of calculation amid the complications of life is the sign of a strong will, which poets, weaklings, and men who live a purely intellectual life can never counterfeit. Lucien was living from hand to mouth, spending his money as fast as he made it, like many another journalist, nor did he give so much as a thought to those periodically recurrent days of reckoning which chequer the life of the Bohemian in Paris so sadly. In dress and figure he was a rival for the great dandies of the day. Coralie, like all zealots, loved to adorn her idol. She ruined herself to give her beloved poet the accoutrements which had so stirred his envy in the garden of the Tuileries. Lucien had wonderful canes and a charming eyeglass. He had diamond studs and scarf rings and signet rings, besides an assortment of waistcoats marvelous to behold, and in sufficient number to match every color in a variety of costumes. His transition to the estate of dandy swiftly followed. When he went to the German minister's dinner, all the young men regarded him with suppressed envy, yet de Marsay, Vandenesse, Ajuda Pinto, Maxime de Troyes, Rastignac, Beaudenord, Manerville, and the Duc de Maufrigneuse gave place to none in the kingdom of fashion. Men of fashion are as jealous among themselves as women, and in the same way. Lucien was placed between Madame de Montcornet and Madame d'Espard, in whose honor the dinner was given. Both ladies overwhelmed him with flatteries. "Why did you turn your back on society when you would have been so well received?" asked the Marquise. "Everyone was prepared to make much of you. And I have a quarrel with you, too. You owed me a call. I am still waiting to receive it. I saw you at the opera the other day, and you would not deign to come to see me, nor to take any notice of me." "Your cousin, madame, so unmistakably dismissed me." "Oh, you do not know women," the Marquise d'Espard broke in upon him. "You have wounded the most angelic heart, the noblest nature that I know. You do not know all that Louise was trying to do for you, nor how tactfully she laid her plans for you. Oh, and she would have succeeded," the Marquise continued, replying to Lucien's mute incredulity. "Her husband is dead now, died, as he was bound to die, of an indigestion. Could you doubt that she would be free sooner or later? And can you suppose that she would like to be Madame Chardon? It was worth while to take some trouble to gain the title of Comtesse de Rubempre. Love, you see, is a great vanity, which requires the lesser vanities to be in harmony with itself, especially in marriage. I might love you to madness, which is to say, sufficiently to marry you, and yet I should find it very unpleasant to be called Madame Chardon. You can see that. And now that you understand the difficulties of Paris life, you will know how many roundabout ways you must take to reach your end. Very well, then, you must admit that Louise was aspiring to an all but impossible piece of court favor. She was quite unknown, she is not rich, and therefore she could not afford to neglect any means of success. You are clever," the Marquise d'Espard continued, "but we women, when we love, are cleverer than the cleverest man. My cousin tried to make that absurd Châtelet useful. Oh," she broke off, I owe not a little amusement to you. Your articles on Châtelet made me laugh heartily." Lucien knew not what to think of all this. Of the treachery and bad faith of journalism he had had some experience, but in spite of his perspicacity, he scarcely expected to find bad faith or treachery in society. There were some sharp lessons in store for him. "But, madame," he objected, for her words aroused a lively curiosity, "is not the heron under your protection?" "One is obliged to be civil to one's worst enemies in society," protested she. "One may be bored, but one must look as if the talk was amusing, and not seldom one seems to sacrifice friends, the better to serve them. Are you still a novice? You mean to write, and yet you know nothing of current deceit? My cousin apparently sacrificed you to the heron, but how could she dispense with his influence for you? Our friend stands well with the present ministry, and we have made him see that your attacks will do him service, up to a certain point, for we want you to make it up again some of these days. Châtelet has received compensations for his troubles, for, as des Lupeaulx said, while the newspapers are making Châtelet ridiculous, they will leave the ministry in peace." There was a pause. The Marquise left Lucien to his own reflections. "Monsieur Blondet led me to hope that I should have the pleasure of seeing you in my house," said the Comtesse de Montcornet. "You will meet a few artists and men of letters, and some one else who has the keenest desire to become acquainted with you, Mademoiselle des Touches, the owner of talents rare among our sex. You will go to her house, no doubt. Mademoiselle des Touches, or Camille Maupin, if you prefer it, is prodigiously rich, and presides over one of the most remarkable salons in Paris. She has heard that you are as handsome as you are clever, and is dying to meet you." Lucien could only pour out incoherent thanks and glance enviously at Émile Blondet. There was as great a difference between a great lady like Madame de Montcornet and Coralie as between Coralie and a girl out of the streets. The Countess was young and witty and beautiful, with the very white fairness of women of the North. Her mother was the Princess Sherbelloff, and the minister before dinner had paid her the most respectful attention. By this time the Marquise had made an end of trifling disdainfully with the wing of a chicken. "My poor Louise felt so much affection for you," she said. "She took me into her confidence. I knew her dreams of a great career for you. She would have borne a great deal, but what scorn you showed her when you sent back her letters! Cruelty we can forgive. Those who hurt us must have still some faith in us. But indifference is like polar snows, it extinguishes all life. So you must see that you have lost a precious affection through your own fault. Why break with her? Even if she had scorned you, you had your way to make, had you not? Your name to win back? Louise thought of all that." "Then why was she silent?" "Eh, mon Dieu!" cried the Marquise. "It was I myself who advised her not to take you into her confidence. Between ourselves, you know, you seemed so little used to the ways of the world that I took alarm. I was afraid that your inexperience and rash ardor might wreck our carefully made schemes. Can you recollect yourself as you were then? You must admit that if you could see your double to-day, you would say the same yourself. You are not like the same man. That was our mistake. But would one man in 1,000 combine such intellectual gifts with such wonderful aptitude for taking the tone of society? I did not think that you would be such an astonishing exception. You were transformed so quickly, you acquired the manner of Paris so easily, that I did not recognize you in the Bois de Boulogne a month ago." Lucien heard the great lady with inexpressible pleasure. The flatteries were spoken with such a petulant, childlike, confiding air, and she seemed to take such a deep interest in him, that he thought of his first evening at the Panorama Dramatique, and began to fancy that some such miracle was about to take place a second time. Everything had smiled upon him since that happy evening. His youth, he thought, was the talisman that worked this change. He would prove this great lady. She should not take him unawares. Then what were these schemes which have turned to chimeras, madame? Asked he. Louise meant to obtain a royal patent permitting you to bear the name and title of Rubempre. She wished to put Chardon out of sight. Your opinions have put that out of question now, but then it would not have been so hard to manage, and a title would mean a fortune for you. You will look on these things as trifles and visionary ideas, she continued, but we know something of life, and we know, too, all the solid advantages of a count's title when it is borne by a fashionable and extremely charming young man. Announce Monsieur Chardon and Monsieur le Comte de Rubempre before heiresses or English girls with $1 million to their fortune, and note the difference of the effect. The Count might be in debt, but he would find open hearts. His good looks, brought into relief by his title, would be like a diamond in a rich setting. Monsieur Chardon would not be so much as noticed. We have not invented these notions. They are everywhere in the world, even among the bourgeois. You are turning your back on fortune at this minute. Do you see that good-looking young man? He is the Vicomte Félix de Vandenesse, one of the king's private secretaries. The king is fond enough of young men of talent, and Vandenesse came from the provinces, with baggage nearly as light as yours. You are 1,000 times cleverer than he, but do you belong to a great family? Have you a name? You know des Lupeaulx. His name is very much like yours, for he was born a Chardin. Well, he would not sell his little farm of Lupeaulx for $1 million. He will be Comte des Lupeaulx some day, and perhaps his grandson may be a duke. You have made a false start, and if you continue in that way, it will be all over with you. See how much wiser Monsieur Émile Blondet has been. He is engaged on a government newspaper. He is well looked on by those in authority. He can afford to mix with liberals, for he holds sound opinions, and sooner or later he will succeed. But then he understood how to choose his opinions and his protectors. Your charming neighbor, Madame d'Espard glanced at Madame de Montcornet, was a Troisville. There are 2 peers of France in the family and 2 deputies. She made a wealthy marriage with her name. She sees a great deal of society at her house. She has influence. She will move the political world for young Monsieur Blondet. Where will a Coralie take you? In a few years' time you will be hopelessly in debt and weary of pleasure. You have chosen badly in love, and you are arranging your life ill. The woman whom you delight to wound was at the opera the other night, and this was how she spoke of you. She deplored the way in which you were throwing away your talent and the prime of youth. She was thinking of you, and not of herself, all the while. Ah, if you were only telling me the truth, madame, cried Lucien. What object should I have in telling lies? Returned the Marquise, with a glance of cold disdain which annihilated him. He was so dashed by it that the conversation dropped, for the Marquise was offended and said no more. Lucien was nettled by her silence, but he felt that it was due to his own clumsiness, and promised himself that he would repair his error. He turned to Madame de Montcornet and talked to her of Blondet, extolling that young writer for her benefit. The Countess was gracious to him, and asked him, at a sign from Madame d'Espard, to spend an evening at her house. It was to be a small and quiet gathering, to which only friends were invited. Madame de Bargeton would be there in spite of her mourning. Lucien would be pleased, she was sure, to meet Madame de Bargeton. "Madame la Marquise says that all the wrong is on my side," said Lucien. "So surely it rests with her cousin, does it not, to decide whether she will meet me? Put an end to those ridiculous attacks which only couple her name with the name of a man for whom she does not care at all, and you will soon sign a treaty of peace. You thought that she had used you ill, I am told, but I myself have seen her in sadness because you had forsaken her. Is it true that she left the provinces on your account?" Lucien smiled. He did not venture to make any other reply. "Oh, how could you doubt the woman who made such sacrifices for you? Beautiful and intellectual as she is, she deserves besides to be loved for her own sake, and Madame de Bargeton cared less for you than for your talents. Believe me, women value intellect more than good looks," added the Countess, stealing a glance at Émile Blondet. In the Minister's hotel, Lucien could see the differences between the great world and that other world beyond the pale in which he had lately been living. There was no sort of resemblance between the two kinds of splendor, no single point in common. The loftiness and disposition of the rooms in one of the handsomest houses in the Faubourg Saint-Germain, the ancient gilding, the breadth of decorative style, the subdued richness of the accessories, all this was strange and new to him. But Lucien had learned very quickly to take luxury for granted, and he showed no surprise. His behavior was as far removed from assurance or fatuity on the one hand, as from complacency and servility upon the other. His manner was good. He found favor in the eyes of all who were not prepared to be hostile, like the younger men who resented his sudden intrusion into the great world, and felt jealous of his good looks and his success. When they rose from table, he offered his arm to Madame d'Espard, and was not refused. Rastignac, watching him, saw that the Marquise was gracious to Lucien, and came in the character of a fellow countryman to remind the poet that they had met once before at Madame du Val-Noble's. The young patrician seemed anxious to find an ally in the great man from his own province, asked Lucien to breakfast with him some morning, and offered to introduce him to some young men of fashion. Lucien was nothing loath. "The dear Blondet is coming," said Rastignac. The two were standing near the Marquis de Ronquerolles, the Duc de Rhétoré, de Marsay, and Général Montriveau. The Minister came across to join the group. "Well," said he, addressing Lucien with a bluff German heartiness that concealed his dangerous subtlety, "well, so you have made your peace with Madame d'Espard. She is delighted with you, and we all know," he added, looking round the group, "how difficult it is to please her." "Yes, but she adores intellect," said Rastignac, "and my illustrious fellow countryman has wit enough to sell." "He will soon find out that he is not doing well for himself," Blondet put in briskly. "He will come over, he will soon be one of us." Those who stood around Lucien rang the changes on this theme. The older and responsible men laid down the law with one or two profound remarks. The younger ones made merry at the expense of the Liberals. "He simply tossed up head or tails for right or left, I am sure," remarked Blondet, "but now he will choose for himself." Lucien burst out laughing. He thought of his talk with Lousteau that evening in the Luxembourg Gardens. "He has taken on a bear leader," continued Blondet, "one Etienne Lousteau, a newspaper hack who sees a 5-franc piece in a column. Lousteau's politics consist in a belief that Napoleon will return, and this seems to me to be still more simple, in a confidence in the gratitude and patriotism of their worships, the gentlemen of the Left. As a Rubempre, Lucien's sympathies should lean towards the aristocracy. As a journalist, he ought to be for authority, or he will never be either Rubempre or a Secretary General." The minister now asked Lucien to take a hand at whist, but to the great astonishment of those present, he declared that he did not know the game. "Come early to me on the day of that breakfast affair," Rastignac whispered, "and I will teach you to play. You are a discredit to the royal city of Angoulême, and, to repeat Monsieur de Talleyrand's saying, you are laying up an unhappy old age for yourself." Des Lupeaulx was announced. He remembered Lucien, whom he had met at Madame du Val-Noble's, and bowed with a semblance of friendliness which the poet could not doubt. Des Lupeaulx was in favor. He was a master of requests, and did the ministry secret services. He was, moreover, cunning and ambitious, slipping himself in everywhere. He was everybody's friend, for he never knew whom he might need. He saw plainly that this was a young journalist whose social success would probably equal his success in literature, saw, too, that the poet was ambitious, and overwhelmed him with protestations and expressions of friendship and interest, till Lucien felt as if they were old friends already, and took his promises and speeches for more than their worth. Des Lupeaulx made a point of knowing a man thoroughly well if he wanted to get rid of him or feared him as a rival. So, to all appearance, Lucien was well received. He knew that much of his success was owing to the Duc de Rhétoré, the minister, Madame d'Espard, and Madame de Montcornet, and went to spend a few moments with the two ladies before taking leave, and talked his very best for them. "What a coxcomb!" said des Lupeaulx, turning to the Marquise when he had gone. "He will be rotten before he is ripe," de Marsay added, smiling. "You must have private reasons of your own, madame, for turning his head in this way." When Lucien stepped into the carriage in the courtyard, he found Coralie waiting for him. She had come to fetch him. The little attention touched him. He told her the history of his evening, and, to his no small astonishment, the new notions which even now were running in his head met with Coralie's approval. She strongly advised him to enlist under the ministerial banner. "You have nothing to expect from the Liberals but hard knocks," she said. "They plot and conspire, they murdered the Duc de Berry. Will they upset the government? Never! You will never come to anything through them, while you will be Comte de Rubempre if you throw in your lot with the other side. You might render services to the State, and be a peer of France, and marry an heiress. Be an ultra. It is the proper thing, besides," she added, this being the last word with her on all subjects. "I dined with the Val-Noble. She told me that Theodore Gaillard is really going to start his little Royalist review, so as to reply to your witticisms and the jokes in the Miroir. To hear them talk, Monsieur Villele's party will be in office before the year is out. Try to turn the change to account before they come to power, and say nothing to Etienne and your friends, for they are quite equal to playing you some ill turn." A week later, Lucien went to Madame de Montcornet's house, and saw the woman whom he had so loved, whom later he had stabbed to the heart with a jest. He felt the most violent agitation at the sight of her, for Louise also had undergone a transformation. She was the Louise that she would always have been but for her detention in the provinces. She was a great lady. There was a grace and refinement in her mourning dress which told that she was a happy widow. Lucien fancied that this coquetry was aimed in some degree at him, and he was right. But, like an ogre, he had tasted flesh, and all that evening he vacillated between Coralie's warm, voluptuous beauty and the dried-up, haughty, cruel Louise. He could not make up his mind to sacrifice the actress to the great lady. And Madame de Bargeton, all the old feeling reviving in her at the sight of Lucien, Lucien's beauty, Lucien's cleverness, was waiting and expecting that sacrifice all evening. And after all her insinuating speeches and her fascinations, she had her trouble for her pains. She left the room with a fixed determination to be revenged. "Well, dear Lucien," she had said, and in her kindness there was both generosity and Parisian grace. "Well, dear Lucien, so you, that were to have been my pride, took me for your first victim, and I forgave you, my dear, for I felt that in such a revenge there was a trace of love still left." With that speech, and the queenly way in which it was uttered, Madame de Bargeton recovered her position. Lucien, convinced that he was 1,000 times in the right, felt that he had been put in the wrong. Not one word of the causes of the rupture, not one syllable of the terrible farewell letter. A woman of the world has a wonderful genius for diminishing her faults by laughing at them. She can obliterate them all with a smile or a question of feigned surprise, and she knows this. She remembers nothing. She can explain everything. She is amazed, asks questions, comments, amplifies, and quarrels with you, till in the end her sins disappear like stains on the application of a little soap and water. Black as ink you knew them to be, and lo, in a moment you behold immaculate white innocence, and lucky are you if you do not find that you yourself have sinned in some way beyond redemption. In a moment old illusions regained their power over Lucien and Louise. They talked like friends, as before. But when the lady, with a hesitating sigh, put the question, "Are you happy?" Lucien was not ready with a prompt, decided answer. He was intoxicated with gratified vanity. Coralie, who, let us admit it, had made life easy for him, had turned his head. A melancholy "no" would have made his fortune. But he must needs begin to explain his position with regard to Coralie. He said that he was loved for his own sake. He said a good many foolish things that a man will say when he is smitten with a tender passion, and thought the while that he was doing a clever thing. Madame de Bargeton bit her lips. There was no more to be said. Madame d'Espard brought Madame de Montcornet to her cousin, and Lucien became the hero of the evening, so to speak. He was flattered, petted, and made much of by the three women. He was entangled with art which no words can describe. His social success in this fine and brilliant circle was at least as great as his triumphs in journalism. Beautiful Mademoiselle des Touches, so well known as Camille Maupin, asked him to one of her Wednesday dinners. His beauty, now so justly famous, seemed to have made an impression upon her. Lucien exerted himself to show that his wit equaled his good looks, and Mademoiselle des Touches expressed her admiration with a playful outspokenness and a pretty fervor of friendship, which deceives those who do not know life in Paris to its depths, nor suspect how continual enjoyment whets the appetite for novelty. If she should like me as much as I like her, we might abridge the romance," said Lucien, addressing de Marsay and Rastignac. "You both of you write romances too well to care to live them," returned Rastignac. "Can men and women who write ever fall in love with each other? A time is sure to come when they begin to make little cutting remarks." "It would not be a bad dream for you," laughed de Marsay. "The charming young lady is 30 years old, it is true, but she has an income of 80,000 livres. She is adorably capricious, and her style of beauty wears well. Coralie is a silly little fool, my dear boy, well enough for a start, for a young spark must have a mistress, but unless you make some great conquest in the great world, an actress will do you harm in the long run. Now, my boy, go and cut out Conti. Here he is, just about to sing with Camille Maupin. Poetry has taken precedence of music ever since time began." But when Lucien heard Mademoiselle des Touches' voice blending with Conti's, his hopes fled. "Conti sings too well," he told des Lupeaulx, and he went back to Madame de Bargeton, who carried him off to Madame d'Espard in another room. "Well, will you not interest yourself in him?" asked Madame de Bargeton. The Marquise spoke with an air half kindly, half insolent. "Let Monsieur Chardon first put himself in such a position that he will not compromise those who take an interest in him," she said. "If he wishes to drop his patronymic and to bear his mother's name, he should at any rate be on the right side, should he not?" "In less than 2 months I will arrange everything," said Lucien. "Very well," returned Madame d'Espard. "I will speak to my father and uncle. They are in waiting. They will speak to the Chancellor for you." End of chapter 24. Chapter 25 of A Distinguished Provincial at Paris by Honoré de Balzac. Translated by Ellen Marriage. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Bruce Peary. Chapter 25. The diplomatist and the 2 women had very soon discovered Lucien's weak side. The poet's head was turned by the glory of the aristocracy. Every man who entered the rooms bore a sounding name mounted in a glittering title, and he himself was plain Chardon. Unspeakable mortification filled him at the sound of it. Wherever he had been during the last few days, that pang had been constantly present with him. He felt, moreover, a sensation quite as unpleasant when he went back to his desk after an evening spent in the great world, in which he made a tolerable figure, thanks to Coralie's carriage and Coralie's servants. He learned to ride in order to escort Madame d'Espard, Mademoiselle des Touches, and the Comtesse de Montcornet when they drove in the Bois, a privilege which he had envied other young men so greatly when he first came to Paris. Finot was delighted to give his right-hand man an order for the opera, so Lucien wasted many an evening there, and thenceforward he was among the exquisites of the day. The poet asked Rastignac and his new associates to a breakfast, and made the blunder of giving it in Coralie's rooms in the Rue de Vendôme. He was too young, too much of a poet, too self-confident, to discern certain shades and distinctions in conduct. And how should an actress, a good-hearted but uneducated girl, teach him life? His guests were anything but charitably disposed towards him. It was clearly proven to their minds that Lucien the critic and the actress were in collusion for their mutual interests, and all of the young men were jealous of an arrangement which all of them stigmatized. The most pitiless of those who laughed that evening at Lucien's expense was Rastignac himself. Rastignac had made and held his position by very similar means, but so careful had he been of appearances that he could afford to treat scandal as slander. Lucien proved an apt pupil at whist. Play became a passion with him, and so far from disapproving, Coralie encouraged his extravagance with the peculiar short-sightedness of an all-absorbing love, which sees nothing beyond the moment, and is ready to sacrifice anything, even the future, to the present enjoyment. Coralie looked on cards as a safeguard against rivals. A great love has much in common with childhood, a child's heedless, careless, spendthrift ways, a child's laughter and tears. In those days there lived and flourished a set of young men, some of them rich, some poor, and all of them idle, called free livers, viveurs, and indeed they lived with incredible insolence, unabashed and unproductive consumers, and yet more intrepid drinkers. These spendthrifts mingled the roughest practical jokes with a life not so much reckless as suicidal. They drew back from no impossibility, and gloried in pranks which, nevertheless, were confined within certain limits, and as they showed the most original wit in their escapades, it was impossible not to pardon them. No sign of the times more plainly discovered the helotism to which the Restoration had condemned the young manhood of the epoch. The younger men, being at a loss to know what to do with themselves, were compelled to find other outlets for their superabundant energy besides journalism or conspiracy or art or letters. They squandered their strength in the wildest excesses. Such sap and luxuriant power was there in young France. The hard workers among these gilded youths wanted power and pleasure. The artists wished for money. The idle sought to stimulate their appetites, or wished for excitement. One and all of them wanted a place, and one and all were shut out from politics and public life. Nearly all the free livers were men of unusual mental powers. Some held out against the enervating life, others were ruined by it. The most celebrated and the cleverest among them was Eugène Rastignac, who entered, with de Marsay's help, upon a political career, in which he has since distinguished himself. The practical jokes in which the set indulged became so famous that not a few vaudevilles have been founded upon them. Blondet introduced Lucien to this society of prodigals, of which he became a brilliant ornament, ranking next to Bixiou, one of the most mischievous and untiring scoffing wits of his time. All through that winter Lucien's life was one long fit of intoxication, with intervals of easy work. He continued his series of sketches of contemporary life, and very occasionally made great efforts to write a few pages of serious criticism, on which he brought his utmost power of thought to bear. But study was the exception, not the rule, and only undertaken at the bidding of necessity. Dinners and breakfasts, parties of pleasure and play, took up most of his time, and Coralie absorbed all that was left. He would not think of the morrow. He saw besides that his so-called friends were leading the same life, earning money easily by writing publishers' prospectuses and articles paid for by speculators. All of them lived beyond their incomes. None of them thought seriously of the future. Lucien had been admitted into the ranks of journalism and of literature on terms of equality. He foresaw immense difficulties in the way if he should try to rise above the rest. Everyone was willing to look upon him as an equal. No one would have him for a superior. Unconsciously, he gave up the idea of winning fame in literature for it seemed easier to gain success in politics. Intrigue raises less opposition than talent, du Châtelet had said one day, for Lucien and the Baron had made up their quarrel. A plot below the surface rouses no one's attention. Intrigue, moreover, is superior to talent, for it makes something out of nothing, while for the most part the immense resources of talent only injure a man. So Lucien never lost sight of his principal idea, and though tomorrow, following close upon the heels of today in the midst of an orgy, never found the promised work accomplished, Lucien was assiduous in society. He paid court to Madame de Bargeton, the Marquise d'Espard, and the Comtesse de Montcornet. He never missed a single party given by Mademoiselle des Touches, appearing in society after a dinner given by authors or publishers, and leaving the salons for a supper given in consequence of a bet. The demands of conversation and the excitement of play absorbed all the ideas and energy left by excess. The poet had lost the lucidity of judgment and coolness of head, which must be preserved if a man is to see all that is going on around him, and never to lose the exquisite tact which the parvenu needs at every moment. How should he know how many a time Madame de Bargeton left him with wounded susceptibilities, how often she forgave him or added one more condemnation to the rest? Châtelet saw that his rival had still a chance left, so he became Lucien's friend. He encouraged the poet in dissipation that wasted his energies. Rastignac, jealous of his fellow countryman, and thinking besides that Châtelet would be a surer and more useful ally than Lucien, had taken up the Baron's cause. So, some few days after the meeting of the Petrarch and Laura of Angoulême, Rastignac brought about the reconciliation between the poet and the elderly beau at a sumptuous supper given at the Rocher de Cancale. Lucien never returned home till morning, and rose in the middle of the day. Coralie was always at his side. He could not forego a single pleasure. Sometimes he saw his real position, and made good resolutions, but they came to nothing in his idle, easy life, and the mainspring of will grew slack, and only responded to the heaviest pressure of necessity. Coralie had been glad that Lucien should amuse himself. She had encouraged him in this reckless expenditure, because she thought that the cravings which she fostered would bind her lover to her. But, tender-hearted and loving as she was, she found courage to advise Lucien not to forget his work, and once or twice was obliged to remind him that he had earned very little during the month. Their debts were growing frightfully fast. The 1,500 francs which remained from the purchase money of the Marguerite had been swallowed up at once, together with Lucien's first 500 livres. In 3 months he had only made 1,000 francs, yet he felt as though he had been working tremendously hard. But by this time Lucien had adopted the free liver's pleasant theory of debts. Debts are becoming to a young man, but after the age of 25 they are inexcusable. It should be observed that there are certain natures in which a really poetic temper is united with a weakened will, and these, while absorbed in feeling that they may transmute personal experience, sensation, or impression into some permanent form, are essentially deficient in the moral sense which should accompany all observation. Poets prefer rather to receive their own impressions than to enter into the souls of others, to study the mechanism of their feelings and thoughts. So Lucien neither asked his associates what became of those who disappeared from among them, nor looked into the futures of his so-called friends. Some of them were heirs to property, others had definite expectations, yet others either possessed names that were known in the world, or a most robust belief in their destiny, and a fixed resolution to circumvent the law. Lucien, too, believed in his future, on the strength of various profound axiomatic sayings of Blondet's. Everything comes out right at last. If a man has nothing, his affairs cannot be embarrassed. We have nothing to lose but the fortune that we seek. Swim with the stream, it will take you somewhere. A clever man with a footing in society can make a fortune whenever he pleases. That winter, filled as it was with so many pleasures and dissipations, was a necessary interval employed in finding capital for the new Royalist paper. Théodore Gaillard and Hector Merlin only brought out the first number of the Réveil in March 1822. The affair had been settled at Madame du Val-Noble's house. Madame du Val-Noble exercised a certain influence over the great personages, Royalist writers, and bankers who met in her splendid rooms, fit for a tale out of the Arabian Nights, as the elegant and clever courtesan herself used to say, to transact business which could not be arranged elsewhere. The editorship had been promised to Hector Merlin. Lucien, Merlin's intimate, was pretty certain to be his right-hand man, and a feuilleton in a ministerial paper had been promised to him besides. All through the dissipations of that winter, Lucien had been secretly making ready for this change of front. Child as he was, he fancied that he was a deep politician because he concealed the preparation for the approaching transformation scene, while he was counting upon ministerial largesses to extricate himself from embarrassment and to lighten Coralie's secret cares. Coralie said nothing of her distress. She smiled now, as always, but Berenice was bolder. She kept Lucien informed of their difficulties, and the budding great man, moved, after the fashion of poets, by the tale of disasters, would vow that he would begin to work in earnest, and then forget his resolution and drown his fleeting cares in excess. One day Coralie saw the poetic brow overcast, and scolded Berenice, and told her lover that everything would be settled. Madame d'Espard and Madame de Bargeton were waiting for Lucien's profession of his new creed, so they said, before applying through Châtelet for the patent which should permit Lucien to bear the so much desired name. Lucien had proposed to dedicate the Marguerite to Madame d'Espard, and the Marquise seemed to be not a little flattered by a compliment which authors have been somewhat chary of paying since they became a power in the land. But when Lucien went to Dauriat and asked after his book, that worthy publisher met him with excellent reasons for the delay in its appearance. Dauriat had this and that in hand, which took up all his time. A new volume by Canalis was coming out, and he did not want the two books to clash. Monsieur de Lamartine's second series of meditations was in the press, and two important collections of poetry ought not to appear together. By this time, however, Lucien's needs were so pressing that he had recourse to Finot, and received an advance on his work. When, at a supper party that evening, the poet-journalist explained his position to his friends in the fast set, they drowned his scruples in champagne, iced with pleasantries. Debts! There was never yet a man of any power without debts. Debts represented satisfied cravings, clamorous vices. A man only succeeds under the pressure of the iron hand of necessity. Debts, forsooth! Why, the one pledge of which a great man can be sure is given him by his friend the pawnbroker, cried Blondet. If you want everything, you must owe for everything, called Bixiou. No, corrected des Lupeaulx, if you owe for everything, you have had everything. The party contrived to convince the novice that his debts were a golden spur to urge on the horses of the chariot of his fortunes. There is always the stock example of Julius Caesar, with his debt of 40 millions, and Friedrich II on an allowance of 1 ducat a month, and a host of other great men whose failings are held up for the corruption of youth, while not a word is said of their wide-reaching ideas, their courage equal to all odds. Creditors seized Coralie's horses, carriage, and furniture at last, for an amount of 4,000 francs. Lucien went to Lousteau and asked his friend to meet his bill for the 1,000 francs lent to pay gaming debts, but Lousteau showed him certain pieces of stamped paper which proved that Florine was in much the same case. Lousteau was grateful, however, and offered to take the necessary steps for the sale of Lucien's Archer of Charles IX. "How came Florine to be in this plight?" asked Lucien. "The Matifat took alarm," said Lousteau. "We have lost him. But if Florine chooses, she can make him pay dear for his treachery. I will tell you all about it." 3 days after this bootless errand, Lucien and Coralie were breakfasting in melancholy spirits beside the fire in their pretty bedroom. Berenice had cooked a dish of eggs for them over the grate, for the cook had gone, and the coachman and servants had taken leave. They could not sell the furniture, for it had been attached. There was not a single object of any value in the house. A goodly collection of pawn tickets, forming a very instructive octavo volume, represented all the gold, silver, and jewelry. Berenice had kept back a couple of spoons and forks. That was all. Lousteau's newspaper was of service now to Coralie and Lucien, little as they suspected it, for the tailor, dressmaker, and milliner were afraid to meddle with a journalist who was quite capable of writing down their establishments. Etienne Lousteau broke in upon their breakfast with a shout of "Hurrah! Long live the Archer of Charles IX! And I have converted 100 francs worth of books into cash, children. We will go halves." He handed 50 francs to Coralie, and sent Berenice out in quest of a more substantial breakfast. Hector Merlin and I went to a bookseller's trade dinner yesterday, and prepared the way for your romance with cunning insinuations. Dauriat is in treaty, but Dauriat is haggling over it. He won't give more than 4,000 francs for 2,000 copies, and you want 6,000 francs. We made you out twice as great as Sir Walter Scott. Oh, you have such novels as never were in the inwards of you. It is not a mere book for sale, it is a big business. You are not simply the writer of one more or less ingenious novel, you are going to write a whole series. The word series did it. So, mind you, don't forget that you have a great historical series on hand. La Grande Mademoiselle, or The France of Louis XIV, Cotillon I, or The Early Days of Louis XV, The Queen and the Cardinal, or Paris and the Fronde, The Son of the Concini, or Richelieu's Intrigue. These novels will be announced on the wrapper of the book. We call this maneuver giving a success a toss in the coverlet, for the titles are all to appear on the cover, till you will be better known for the books that you have not written than for the work you have done. And in the press is a way of gaining credit in advance for work that you will do. Come now, let us have a little fun. Here comes the champagne. You can understand, Lucien, that our men opened eyes as big as saucers. By the by, I see that you have saucers still left." "They are attached," explained Coralie. "I understand, and I resume. Show a publisher one manuscript volume, and he will believe in all the rest. A publisher asks to see your manuscript, and gives you to understand that he is going to read it. Why disturb his harmless vanity? They never read a manuscript. They would not publish so many if they did. Well, Hector and I allowed it to leak out that you might consider an offer of 5,000 francs for 3,000 copies in 2 editions. Let me have your Archer. The day after tomorrow we are to breakfast with the publishers, and we will get the upper hand of them." "Who are they?" asked Lucien. "2 partners named Fendant and Cavalier. They are 2 good fellows, pretty straightforward in business. One of them used to be with Vidal and Porchon. The other is the cleverest hand on the Quai des Augustins. They only started in business last year, and have lost a little on translations of English novels. So now my gentlemen have a mind to exploit the native product. There is a rumor current that those dealers in spoiled white paper are trading on other people's capital, but I don't think it matters very much. Chapter 26 of A Distinguished Provincial at Paris by Honoré De Balzac. Translated by Ellen Marriage. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Bruce Peary. Chapter 26. 2 days later, the pair went to a breakfast in the Rue Serpente, in Lucien's old quarter of Paris. Lousteau still kept his room in the Rue de la Harpe, and it was in the same state as before, but this time Lucien felt no surprise. He had been initiated into the life of journalism. He knew all its ups and downs. Since that evening of his introduction to the Wooden Galleries, he had been paid for many an article, and gambled away the money along with the desire to write. He had filled columns not once but many times, in the ingenious ways described by Lousteau on that memorable evening as they went to the Palais Royal. He was dependent upon Barbet and Braulard. He trafficked in books and theatre tickets. He shrank no longer from any attack, from writing any panegyric, and at this moment he was in some sort rejoicing to make all he could out of Lousteau before turning his back on the Liberals. His intimate knowledge of the party would stand him in good stead in future. And Lousteau, on his side, was privately receiving 500 francs of purchase money under the name of commission from Fendant and Cavalier for introducing the future Sir Walter Scott to 2 enterprising tradesmen in search of a French author of Waverley. The firm of Fendant and Cavalier had started in business without any capital whatsoever. A great many publishing houses were established at that time in the same way, and are likely to be established so long as paper-makers and printers will give credit for the time required to play some 7 or 8 of the games of chance called new publications. At that time, as at present, the author's copyright was paid for in bills at 6, 9, and 12 months, a method of payment determined by the custom of the trade, for booksellers settle accounts between themselves by bills at even longer dates. Papermakers and printers are paid in the same way, so that in practice the publisher-bookseller has a dozen or a score of works on sale for a 12-month before he pays for them. Even if only 2 or 3 of these hit the public taste, the profitable speculations pay for the bad, and the publisher pays his way by grafting, as it were, one book upon another. But if all of them turn out badly, or if, for his misfortune, the publisher-bookseller happens to bring out some really good literature which stays on hand until the right public discovers and appreciates it, or if it costs too much to discount the paper that he receives, then resignedly he files his schedule and becomes a bankrupt with an untroubled mind. He was prepared all along for something of the kind. So, all the chances being in favor of the publishers, they staked other people's money, not their own, upon the gaming table of business speculation. This was the case with Fendant and Cavalier. Cavalier brought his experience, Fendant his industry. The capital was a joint stock affair, and very accurately described by that word, for it consisted in a few thousand francs scraped together with difficulty by the mistresses of the pair. Out of this fund they allowed each other a fairly handsome salary, and scrupulously spent it all in dinners to journalists and authors, or at the theatre where their business was transacted, as they said. This questionably honest couple were both supposed to be clever men of business, but Fendant was more slippery than Cavalier. Cavalier, true to his name, travelled about. Fendant looked after business in Paris. A partnership between two publishers is always more or less of a duel, and so it was with Fendant and Cavalier. They had brought out plenty of romances already, such as The Tour du Nord, Le Marchand de Bénard, La Fontaine du Sépulcre, and Tekeli, translations of the works of Galt, an English novelist who never attained much popularity in France. The success of translations of Scott had called the attention of the trade to English novels. The race of publishers, all agog for a second Norman conquest, were seeking industriously for a second Scott, just as at a rather later day every one must needs look for asphalt in stony soil, or bitumen in marshes, and speculate in projected railways. The stupidity of the Paris commercial world is conspicuous in these attempts to do the same thing twice, for success lies in contraries, and in Paris, of all places in the world, success spoils success. So, beneath the title of Strelitz or Russia 100 years ago, Fendant and Cavalier rashly added in big letters the words, "in the style of Scott." Fendant and Cavalier were in great need of a success. A single good book might float their sunken bales, they thought, and there was the alluring prospect, besides, of articles in the newspapers, the great way of promoting sales in those days. A book is very seldom bought and sold for its just value, and purchases are determined by considerations quite other than the merits of the work. So Fendant and Cavalier thought of Lucien as a journalist, and of his book as a saleable article, which would help them to tide over their monthly settlement. The partners occupied the ground floor of one of the great old-fashioned houses in the Rue Serpente. Their private office had been contrived at the further end of a suite of large drawing-rooms, now converted into warehouses for books. Lucien and Etienne found the publishers in their office, the agreement drawn up, and the bills ready. Lucien wondered at such prompt action. Fendant was short and thin, and by no means reassuring of aspect. With his low, narrow forehead, sunken nose, and hard mouth, he looked like a Kalmuck Tartar. A pair of small, wide-awake black eyes, the crabbed, irregular outline of his countenance, a voice like a cracked bell. The man's whole appearance, in fact, combined to give the impression that this was a consummate rascal. A honeyed tongue compensated for these disadvantages. and he gained his ends by talk. Cavalier, a stout, thick-set young fellow, looked more like the driver of a mail coach than a publisher. He had hair of a sandy color, a fiery red countenance, and the heavy build and untiring tongue of a commercial traveler. "There is no need to discuss this affair," said Fendant, addressing Lucien and Lousteau. "I have read the work; it is very literary, and so exactly the kind of thing we want that I have sent it off as it is to the printer. The agreement is drawn on the lines laid down, and besides, we always make the same stipulations in all cases. The bills fall due in 6, 9, and 12 months, respectively. You will meet with no difficulty in discounting them, and we will refund you the discount. We have reserved the right of giving a new title to the book. We don't care for The Archer of Charles IX. It doesn't tickle the reader's curiosity sufficiently. There were several kings of that name, you see, and there were so many archers in the Middle Ages. If you had only called it The Soldier of Napoleon now, but The Archer of Charles IX, why, Cavalier would have to give a course of history lessons before he could place a copy anywhere in the provinces." "If you but knew the class of people that we have to do with!" exclaimed Cavalier. "Saint Bartholomew would suit better," continued Fendant. "Catherine de' Medici, or France under Charles IX, would sound more like one of Scott's novels," added Cavalier. "We will settle it when the work is printed," said Fendant. "Do as you please, so long as I approve your title," said Lucien. The agreement was read over, signed in duplicate, and each of the contracting parties took their copy. Lucien put the bills in his pocket with unequaled satisfaction, and the four repaired to Fendant's abode, where they breakfasted on beefsteaks and oysters, kidneys in champagne, and Brie cheese. But if the fare was something of the homeliest, the wines were exquisite. Cavalier had an acquaintance, a traveler in the wine trade. Just as they sat down to table, the printer appeared, to Lucien's surprise, with the first 2 proof sheets. "We want to get on with it," Fendant said. "We are counting on your book. We want a success confoundedly badly." The breakfast, begun at noon, lasted till 5 o'clock. "Where shall we get cash for these things?" asked Lucien as they came away, somewhat heated and flushed with the wine. "We might try Barbet," suggested Etienne, and they turned down to the Quai des Augustins. "Coralie is astonished to the highest degree over Florine's loss. Florine only told her about it yesterday. She seemed to lay the blame of it on you, and was so vexed that she was ready to throw you over." "That's true," said Lousteau. Wine had got the better of prudence, and he unbosomed himself to Lucien, ending up with, "My friend, for you are my friend, Lucien, you lent me 1,000 francs, and you have only once asked me for the money. Shun play. If I had never touched a card, I should be a happy man. I owe money all round. At this moment I have the bailiffs at my heels. Indeed, when I go to the Palais Royal, I have dangerous capes to double." In the language of the fast set, doubling a cape meant dodging a creditor, or keeping out of his way. Lucien had not heard the expression before, but he was familiar with the practice by this time. "Are your debts so heavy?" "A mere trifle," said Lousteau. 1,000 crowns would pull me through. I have resolved to turn steady and give up play, and I have done a little chantage to pay my debts." "What is chantage?" asked Lucien. "It is an English invention recently imported. A chanteur is a man who can manage to put a paragraph in the papers. Never an editor nor a responsible man, for they're not supposed to know anything about it, and there is always a Giroudeau or a Philippe Bridau to be found. A bravo of this stamp finds up somebody who has his own reasons for not wanting to be talked about. Plenty of people have a few peccadillos, or some more or less original sin upon their consciences. There are plenty of fortunes made in ways that would not bear looking into. Sometimes a man has kept the letter of the law, and sometimes he has not, and in either case there is a tidbit of tattle for the inquirer, as, for instance, that tale of Fouché's police surrounding the spies of the prefect of police, who, not being in the secret of the fabrication of forged English banknotes, were just about to pounce on the clandestine printers employed by the minister. Or there is the story of Prince Galation's diamonds, the Maubreuil affair, or the Pombreton will case. The chanteur gets possession of some compromising letter, asks for an interview, and if the man that made the money does not buy silence, the chanteur draws a picture of the press, ready to take the matter up and unravel his private affairs. The rich man is frightened, he comes down with the money, and the trick succeeds. You are committed to some risky venture, which might easily be written down in a series of articles. A chanteur waits upon you and offers to withdraw the articles for a consideration. Chanteurs are sent to men in office who will bargain that their acts and not their private characters are to be attacked. Or they are heedless of their characters and anxious only to shield the woman they love. One of your acquaintance, that charming master of requests, des Lupeaulx, is a kind of agent for affairs of this sort. The rascal has made a position for himself in the most marvelous way in the very centre of power. He is the middleman of the press and the ambassador of the ministers. He works upon a man's self-love. He bribes newspapers to pass over a loan in silence, or to make no comment on a contract which was never put up for public tender, and the jackals of liberal bankers get a share out of it. That was a bit of chantage that you did with Dauriat. He gave you 1,000 crowns to let Nathan alone. In the 18th century, when journalism was still in its infancy, this kind of blackmail was levied by pamphleteers in the pay of favorites and great lords. The original inventor was Pietro Aretino, a great Italian. Kings went in fear of him, as stage players go in fear of a newspaper today. What did you do to the Matifat to make the 1,000 crowns? I attacked Florine in half a dozen papers. Florine complained to Matifat. Matifat went to Braulard to find out what the attacks meant. I did my chantage for Finot's benefit, and Finot put Braulard on the wrong scent. Braulard told the man of drugs that you were demolishing Florine in Coralie's interest. Then Giroudeau went round to Matifat and told him, in confidence, that the whole business could be accommodated if he, Matifat, would consent to sell his 6th share in Finot's review for 10,000 francs. Finot was to give me 1,000 crowns if the dodge succeeded. Well, Matifat was only too glad to get back 10,000 francs out of the 30,000 invested in a risky speculation, as he thought, for Florine had been telling him for several days past that Finot's review was doing badly, and instead of paying a dividend, something was said of calling up more capital. So Matifat was just about to close with the offer, when the manager of the Panorama Dramatique comes to him with some accommodation bills that he wanted to negotiate before filing his schedule. To induce Matifat to take them of him, he let out a word of Finot's trick. Matifat, being a shrewd man of business, took the hint, held tight to his 6th, and is laughing in his sleeve at us. Finot and I are howling with despair. We have been so misguided as to attack a man who has no affection for his mistress, a heartless, soulless wretch. Unluckily, too, for us, Matifat's business is not amenable to the jurisdiction of the press, and he cannot be made to smart for it through his interests. A druggist is not like a hatter or a milliner, or a theatre or a work of art. He is above criticism. You can't run down his opium and dye woods, nor cocoa beans, paint, and pepper. Florine is at her wit's end. The Panorama closes tomorrow, and what will become of her she does not know. "Coralie's engagement at the Gymnase begins in a few days," said Lucien. "She might do something for Florine." "Not she," said Lousteau. "Coralie is not clever, but she is not quite simple enough to help herself to a rival. We are in a mess with a vengeance, and Finot is in such a hurry to buy back his sixth." "Why?" "It is a capital bit of business, my dear fellow. There is a chance of selling the paper for 300,000 francs. Finot would have 1/3, and his partners besides are going to pay him a commission, which he will share with des Lupeaulx. So I propose to do another turn of chantage." "Chantage seems to mean your money or your life." "It is better than that," said Lousteau. "It is your money or your character. A short time ago the proprietor of a minor newspaper was refused credit. The day before yesterday it was announced in his columns that a gold repeater set with diamonds belonging to a certain notability had found its way in a curious fashion into the hands of a private soldier in the Guards. The story promised to the readers might have come from the Arabian Nights. The notability lost no time in asking that editor to dine with him. The editor was distinctly a gainer by the transaction, and contemporary history has lost an anecdote. Whenever the press makes vehement onslaughts upon someone in power, you may be sure that there is some refusal to do a service behind it. Blackmailing with regard to private life is the terror of the richest Englishmen, and a great source of wealth to the press in England, which is infinitely more corrupt than ours. We are children in comparison. In England they will pay 5,000 or 6,000 francs for a compromising letter to sell again." "Then how can you lay hold of Matifat?" asked Lucien. "My dear boy, that low tradesman wrote the queerest letters to Florine. The spelling, style, and matter of them is ludicrous to the last degree. We can strike him in the very midst of his Lares and Penates, where he feels himself safest, without so much as mentioning his name, and he cannot complain, for he lives in fear and terror of his wife. Imagine his wrath when he sees the first number of a little serial entitled The Amours of a Druggist, and is given fair warning that his love letters have fallen into the hands of certain journalists. He talks about the little god Cupid. He tells Florine that she enables him to cross the desert of life, which looks as though he took her for a camel, and spells never with 2 V's. There is enough in that immensely funny correspondence to bring an influx of subscribers for a fortnight. He will shake in his shoes lest an anonymous letter should supply his wife with the key to the riddle. The question is whether Florine will consent to appear to persecute Matifat. She has some principles, which is to say, some hopes, still left. Perhaps she means to keep the letters and make something for herself out of them. She is cunning, as befits my pupil. But as soon as she finds out that a bailiff is no laughing matter, or Finot gives her a suitable present or hopes of an engagement, she will give me the letters, and I will sell them to Finot. Finot will put the correspondence in his uncle's hands, and Giroudeau will bring Matifat to terms." These confidences sobered Lucien. His first thought was that he had some extremely dangerous friends; his second, that it would be impolitic to break with them. For if Madame d'Espard, Madame de Bargeton, and Chatelet should fail to keep their word with him, He might need their terrible power yet. By this time Etienne and Lucien had reached Barbet's miserable bookshop on the quay. Etienne addressed Barbet. "We have 5,000 francs worth of bills at 6, 9, and 12 months, given by Fendant and Cavalier. Are you willing to discount them for us?" "I will give you 3,000 francs for them," said Barbet with imperturbable coolness. 3,000 francs? Echoed Lucien. "Nobody else will give you as much," rejoined the bookseller. "The firm will go bankrupt before 3 months are out. But I happen to know that they have some good books that are hanging on hand. They cannot afford to wait, so I shall buy their stock for cash and pay them with their own bills, and get the books at a reduction of 2,000 francs. That's how it is." "Do you mind losing a couple of thousand francs, Lucien?" asked Lousteau. "Yes," Lucien answered vehemently. He was dismayed by this first rebuff. "You are making a mistake," said Etienne. "You won't find anyone that will take their paper," said Barbet. "Your book is their last stake, sir. The printer will not trust them. They are obliged to leave the copies in pawn with him. If they make a hit now, it will only stave off bankruptcy for another 6 months. Sooner or later they will have to go. They are cleverer at tippling than at bookselling. In my own case, their bills mean business, and that being so, I can afford to give more than a professional discounter who simply looks at the signatures. It is a bill discounter's business to know whether the 3 names on a bill are each good for 30% in case of bankruptcy. And here, at the outset, you only offer 2 signatures, and neither of them worth 10%. The 2 journalists exchanged glances in surprise. Here was a little scrub of a bookseller putting the essence of the art and mystery of bill discounting in these few words. "That will do, Barbet," said Lousteau. "Can you tell us of a bill broker that will look at us?" "There is Daddy Chaboisseau on the Quai Saint-Michel, you know. He tided Fendant over his last monthly settlement. If you won't listen to my offer, you might go and see what he says to you, but you would only come back to me, and then I shall offer you 2,000 francs instead of 3." Etienne and Lucien betook themselves to the Quai Saint-Michel, and found Chaboisseau in a little house with a passage entry. Chaboisseau, a bill discounter, whose dealings were principally with the book trade, lived in a second-floor lodging furnished in the most eccentric manner. A brevet rank banker and millionaire to boot, he had a taste for the classical style. The cornice was in the classical style, the bedstead in the purest classical taste, dated from the time of the Empire, when such things were in fashion. The purple hangings fell over the wall like the classic draperies in the background of one of David's pictures. Chairs and tables, lamps and sconces, and every least detail had evidently been sought with patient care in furniture warehouses. There was the elegance of antiquity about the classic revival, as well as its fragile and somewhat arid grace. The man himself, like his manner of life, was in grotesque contrast with the airy mythological look of his rooms, and it may be remarked that the most eccentric characters are found among men who give their whole energies to money-making. Men of this stamp are, in a certain sense, intellectual libertines. Everything is within their reach. Consequently, their fancy is jaded, and they will make immense efforts to shake off their indifference. The student of human nature can always discover some hobby, some accessible weakness and sensitive spot in their heart. Chaboisseau might have entrenched himself in antiquity as in an impregnable camp. "The man will be an antique to match, no doubt," said Etienne, smiling. Chaboisseau, a little old person with powdered hair, wore a greenish coat and snuff-brown waistcoat. He was tricked out besides in black small clothes, ribbed stockings, and shoes that creaked as he came forward to take the bills. After a short scrutiny, he returned them to Lucien with a serious countenance. Messieurs Fendant and Cavalier are delightful young fellows. They have plenty of intelligence, but I have no money, he said blandly. My friend here would be willing to meet you in the matter of discount, Etienne began. I would not take the bills on any consideration, returned the little broker. The words slid down upon Lousteau's suggestion like the blade of the guillotine on a man's neck. The two friends withdrew, but as Chaboisseau went prudently out with them across the antechamber, Lucien noticed a pile of second-hand books. Chaboisseau had been in the trade, and this was a recent purchase. Shining conspicuous among them, he noticed a copy of a work by the architect Ducereau, which gives exceedingly accurate plans of various royal palaces and chateaux in France. "Could you let me have that book?" he asked. "Yes," said Chaboisseau, transformed into a bookseller. "How much?" 50 francs. "It is dear, but I want it, and I can only pay you with one of the bills, which you refuse to take." "You have a bill there for 500 francs at 6 months. I will take that one of you," said Chaboisseau. Apparently, at the last statement of accounts, there had been a balance of 500 francs in favor of Fendant and Cavalier. They went back to the classical department. Chaboisseau made out a little memorandum, interest so much and commission so much, total deduction 30 francs, then he subtracted 50 francs for Ducereau's book. Finally, from a cash box full of coin, he took 420 francs. "Look here, though, Monsieur Chaboisseau, the bills are either all of them good or all bad alike. Why don't you take the rest?" "This is not discounting. I am paying myself for a sale," said the old man. Etienne and Lucien were still laughing at Chaboisseau without understanding him when they reached Dauriat's shop, and Etienne asked Gabusson to give them the name of a bill broker. Gabusson, thus appealed to, gave them a letter of introduction to a broker in the Boulevard Poissonniere, telling them at the same time that this was the oddest and queerest party, to use his own expression, that he, Gabusson, had come across. The friends took a cab by the hour and went to the address. "If Samanon won't take your..." Chapter 27 of A Distinguished Provincial at Paris by Honoré De Balzac. Translated by Ellen Marriage. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Bruce Peary. Chapter 27. A second-hand bookseller on the ground floor, a second-hand clothes dealer on the first story, and a seller of indecent prints on the second, Samanon carried on a fourth business. He was a money-lender into the bargain. No character in Hoffmann's romances, no sinister brooding miser of Scott's, can compare with this freak of human and Parisian nature, always admitting that Samanon was human. In spite of himself, Lucien shuddered at the sight of the dried-up little old creature, whose bones seemed to be cutting a leather skin, spotted with all sorts of little green and yellow patches, like a portrait by Titian or Veronese when you look at it closely. One of Samanon's eyes was fixed and glassy, the other lively and bright. He seemed to keep that dead eye for the bill-discounting part of his profession, and the other for the trade in the pornographic curiosities upstairs. A few stray white hairs escaping from under a small, sleek, rusty black wig stood erect above a sallow forehead with a suggestion of menace about it. A hollow trench in either cheek defined the outline of the jaws, while a set of projecting teeth, still white, seemed to stretch the skin of the lips with the effect of an equine yawn. The contrast between the ill-assorted eyes and grinning mouth gave Samanon a passably ferocious air, and the very bristles on the man's chin looked stiff and sharp as pins. Nor was there the slightest sign about him of any desire to redeem a sinister appearance by attention to the toilet. His threadbare jacket was all but dropping to pieces. A cravat which had once been black was frayed by contact with a stubble chin, and left on exhibition a throat as wrinkled as a turkey gobbler's. This was the individual whom Etienne and Lucien discovered in his filthy counting-house, busily affixing tickets to the backs of a parcel of books from a recent sale. In a glance, the friends exchanged the innumerable questions raised by the existence of such a creature. Then they presented Gabusson's introduction and Fendant and Cavalier's bills. Samanon was still reading the note when a third comer entered, the wearer of a short jacket, which seemed in the dimly lighted shop to be cut out of a piece of zinc roofing, so solid was it by reason of alloy with all kinds of foreign matter. Oddly attired as he was, the man was an artist of no small intellectual power, and 10 years later he was destined to assist in the inauguration of the great but ill-founded Saint Simonian system. "I want my coat, my black trousers, and satin waistcoat," said this person, pressing a numbered ticket on Samanon's attention. Samanon touched the brass button of a bell-pull, and a woman came down from some upper region, a Normande apparently, to judge by her rich, fresh complexion. "Let the gentleman have his clothes," said Samanon, holding out a hand to the newcomer. "It's a pleasure to do business with you, sir, but that youngster whom one of your friends introduced to me took me in most abominably." "Took him in," chuckled the newcomer, pointing out Samanon to the two journalists with an extremely comical gesture. The great man dropped 30 sous into the money-lender's yellow, wrinkled hand. Like the Neapolitan Lazzaroni, he was taking his best clothes out of pawn for a state occasion. The coins dropped jingling into the till. "What queer business are you up to?" asked Lousteau of the artist, an opium-eater who dwelt among visions of enchanted palaces till he either could not or would not create. "He lends you a good deal more than an ordinary pawnbroker on anything you pledge, and besides, he is so awfully charitable, he allows you to take your clothes out when you must have something to wear. I am going to dine with the Kellers and my mistress to-night," he continued, "and to me it is easier to find 30 sous than 200 francs, so I keep my wardrobe here. It has brought the charitable usurer 100 francs in the last 6 months. Samanon has devoured my library already, volume by volume, livre à livre." "And sou by sou," Lousteau said with a laugh. "I will let you have 1,500 francs," said Samanon, looking up. Lucien started as if the bill-broker had thrust a red-hot skewer through his heart. Samanon was subjecting the bills and their dates to a close scrutiny. "And even then," he added, "I must see Fendant first. He ought to deposit some books with me. You aren't worth much," turning to Lucien. "You are living with Coralie, and your furniture has been attached." Lousteau, watching Lucien, saw him take up his bills and dash out into the street. "He is the devil himself!" exclaimed the poet. For several seconds he stood outside gazing at the shop front. The whole place was so pitiful that a passer-by could not see it without smiling at the sight, and wondering what kind of business a man could do among those mean, dirty shelves of ticketed books. A very few moments later, the great man in incognito came out, very well dressed, smiled at his friends, and turned to go with them in the direction of the Passage des Panoramas, where he meant to complete his toilet by the polishing of his boots. If you see Samanon in a bookseller's shop, or calling on a paper merchant or a printer, you may know that it is all over with that man, said the artist. Samanon is the undertaker come to take the measurements for a coffin. You won't discount your bills now, Lucien, said Etienne. If Samanon will not take them, nobody else will. He is the ultima ratio, said the stranger. He is one of Gigonnet's lambs, a spy for Palma, Werbrust, Gobseck, and the rest of those crocodiles who swim in the Paris money market. Every man with a fortune to make or unmake is sure to come across one of them sooner or later. If you cannot discount your bills at 50%, remarked Lousteau, you must exchange them for hard cash. How? Give them to Coralie. Camusot will cash them for her. You are disgusted, added Lousteau, as Lucien cut him short with a start. What nonsense! How can you allow such a silly scruple to turn the scale when your future is in the balance? I shall take this money to Coralie in any case, began Lucien. Here is more folly, cried Lousteau. You will not keep your creditors quiet with 400 francs when you must have 4,000. Let us keep a little and get drunk on it if we lose the rest at Rouge et Noir. That is sound advice, said the great man. Those words, spoken not 4 paces from Frascati's, were magnetic in their effect. The friends dismissed their cab and went up to the gaming table. At the outset they won 3,000 francs. Then they lost and fell to 500. Again they won 3,700 francs, and again they lost all but a 5-franc piece. After another turn of luck, they staked 2,000 francs on an even number to double the stake at a stroke. An even number had not turned up for 5 times in succession, and this was the 6th time. They punted the whole sum, and an odd number turned up once more. After 2 hours of all-absorbing, frenzied excitement, the two dashed down the staircase with the 100 francs kept back for the dinner. Upon the steps, between 2 pillars which support the little sheet-iron veranda to which so many eyes have been upturned in longing or despair, Lousteau stopped and looked into Lucien's flushed, excited face. "Let us just try 50 francs," he said. And up the stairs again they went. An hour later they owned 1,000 crowns. Black had turned up for the 5th consecutive time. They trusted that their previous luck would not repeat itself, and put the whole sum on the red. Black turned up for the 6th time. They had lost. It was now 6 o'clock. "Let us just try 25 francs," said Lucien. The new venture was soon made and lost. The 25 francs went in 5 stakes. Then Lucien, in a frenzy, flung down his last 25 francs on the number of his age, and won. No words can describe how his hands trembled as he raked in the coins which the bank paid him one by one. He handed 10 louis to Lousteau. "Fly," he cried, "take it to Very's." Lousteau took the hint and went to order dinner. Lucien, left alone, laid his 30 louis on the red and won. Emboldened by the inner voice which a gambler always hears, he staked the whole again on the red, and again he won. He felt as if there were a furnace within him. Without heeding the voice, he laid 120 louis on the black, and lost. Then, to the torturing excitement of suspense, succeeded the delicious feeling of relief, known to the gambler who has nothing left to lose, and must perforce leave the palace of fire in which his dreams melt and vanish. He found Lousteau at Very's, and flung himself upon the cookery, to make use of La Fontaine's expression, and drowned his cares in wine. By 9 o'clock his ideas were so confused that he could not imagine why the portress in the Rue de Vendôme persisted in sending him to the Rue de la Lune. "Mademoiselle Coralie has gone," said the woman. "She has taken lodgings elsewhere. She left her address with me on this scrap of paper." Lucien was too far gone to be surprised at anything. He went back to the cab which had brought him, and was driven to the Rue de la Lune, making puns to himself on the name of the street as he went. The news of the failure of the Panorama Dramatique had come like a thunderclap. Coralie, taking alarm, made haste to sell her furniture with the consent of her creditors to little old Cardot, who installed Florentine in the rooms at once. The tradition of the house remained unbroken. Coralie paid her creditors and satisfied the landlord, proceeding with her washing day, as she called it, while Berenice bought the absolutely indispensable necessaries to furnish a fourth-floor lodging in the Rue de la Lune, a few doors from the Gymnase. Here Coralie was waiting for Lucien's return. She had brought her love unsullied out of the shipwreck, and 1,200 francs. Lucien, more than half intoxicated, poured out his woes to Coralie and Berenice. "You did quite right, my angel," said Coralie, with her arms about his neck. "Berenice can easily negotiate your bills with Braulard." The next morning Lucien awoke to an enchanted world of happiness made about him by Coralie. She was more loving and tender in those days than she had ever been. Perhaps she thought that the wealth of love in her heart should make him amends for the poverty of their lodging. She looked bewitchingly charming, with the loose hair straying from under the crushed white silk handkerchief about her head. There was soft laughter in her eyes. Her words were as bright as the first rays of sunrise that shone in through the windows, pouring a flood of gold upon such charming poverty. Not that the room was squalid. The walls were covered with a sea-green paper, bordered with red. There was one mirror over the chimney-piece, and a second above the chest of drawers. The bare boards were covered with a cheap carpet, which Berenice had bought in spite of Coralie's orders, and paid for out of her own little store. A wardrobe, with a glass door and a chest, held the lovers' clothing. The mahogany chairs were covered with blue cotton stuff, and Berenice had managed to save a clock and a couple of china vases from the catastrophe, as well as 4 spoons and forks and half a dozen little spoons. The bedroom was entered from the dining-room, which might have belonged to a clerk with an income of 1,200 francs. The kitchen was next the landing, and Berenice slept above in an attic. The rent was not more than 100 crowns. The dismal house boasted a sham carriage entrance, the porter's box being contrived behind one of the useless leaves of the gate, and lighted by a peephole through which that personage watched the comings and goings of 17 families, for this hive was a good-paying property, in auctioneer's phrase. Lucien, looking round the room, discovered a desk, an easy-chair, paper, pens, and ink. The sight of Berenice in high spirits, she was building hopes on Coralie's debut at the Gymnase, and of Coralie herself conning her part with a knot of blue ribbon tied about it, drove all cares and anxieties from the sobered poet's mind. So long as nobody in society hears of this sudden come-down, we shall pull through, he said. After all, we have 4,500 francs before us. I will turn my new position in royalist journalism to account. Tomorrow we shall start the Réveil. I am an old hand now, and I will make something out." And Coralie, seeing nothing but love in the words, kissed the lips that uttered them. By this time Berenice had set the table near the fire and served a modest breakfast of scrambled eggs, a couple of cutlets, coffee, and cream. Just then there came a knock at the door, and Lucien, to his astonishment, beheld three of his loyal friends of old days, d'Arthez, Léon Giraud, and Michel Chrestien. He was deeply touched, and asked them to share the breakfast. "No, we have come on more serious business than condolence," said d'Arthez. "We know the whole story. We have just come from the Rue de Vendôme. You know my opinions, Lucien. Under any other circumstances, I should be glad to hear that you had adopted my political convictions. But situated as you are with regard to the liberal press, it is impossible for you to go over to the ultras. Your life will be sullied, your character blighted forever. We have come to entreat you, in the name of our friendship, weakened though it may be, not to soil yourself in this way. You have been prominent in attacking the Romantics, the right, and the government. You cannot now declare for the government, the right, and the Romantics." "My reasons for the change are based on lofty grounds. The end will justify the means," said Lucien. "Perhaps you do not fully comprehend our position on the side of the government," said Léon Giraud. "The government, the court, the Bourbons, the absolutist party, or to sum up in the general expression, the whole system opposed to the constitutional system, may be divided upon the question of the best means of extinguishing the revolution, but it is unanimous as to the advisability of extinguishing the newspapers. The Réveil, the Foudre, and the Drapeau Blanc have all been founded for the express purpose of replying to the slander, gibes, and railing of the liberal press. I cannot approve them, for it is precisely this failure to recognize the grandeur of our priesthood that has led us to bring out a serious and self-respecting paper, which perhaps," he added parenthetically, "may exercise a worthy influence before very long, and win respect, and carry weight. But this royalist artillery is destined for a first attempt at reprisals. The Liberals are to be paid back in their own coin, shaft for shaft, wound for wound. What can come of it, Lucien? The majority of newspaper readers incline for the left, and in the press, as in warfare, the victory is with the big battalions. You will be blackguards, liars, enemies of the people. The other side will be defenders of their country, martyrs, men to be held in honor, though they may be even more hypocritical and slippery than their opponents. In these ways, the pernicious influence of the press will be increased, while the most odious form of journalism will receive sanction. Insult and personalities will become a recognized privilege of the press. Newspapers have taken this tone in the subscribers' interests, and when both sides have recourse to the same weapons, the standard is set and the general tone of journalism taken for granted. When the evil is developed to its fullest extent, restrictive laws will be followed by prohibitions. There will be a return of the censorship of the press imposed after the assassination of the Duc de Berry, and repealed since the opening of the Chambers. And do you know what the nation will conclude from the debate? The people will believe the insinuations of the liberal press. They will think that the Bourbons mean to attack the rights of property acquired by the Revolution, and some fine day they will rise and shake off the Bourbons. You are not only soiling your life, Lucien, you are going over to the losing side. You are too young, too lately a journalist, too little initiated into the secret springs of motive and the tricks of the craft. You have aroused too much jealousy not to fall a victim to the general hue and cry that will be raised against you in the Liberal newspapers. You will be drawn into the fray by party spirit, now still at fever heat, though the fever, which spent itself in violence in 1815 and 1816, now appears in debates in the Chamber and polemics in the papers. "I am not quite a featherhead, my friends," said Lucien, "though you may choose to see a poet in me. Whatever may happen, I shall gain one solid advantage which no Liberal victory can give me. By the time your victory is won, I shall have gained my end." "We will cut off your hair," said Michel Chrestien, with a laugh. "I shall have my children by that time," said Lucien, "and if you cut off my head, it will not matter." The three could make nothing of Lucien. Intercourse with the great world had developed in him the pride of caste, the vanities of the aristocrat. The poet thought, and not without reason, that there was a fortune in his good looks and intellect, accompanied by the name and title of Rubempre. Madame d'Espard and Madame de Bargeton held him fast by this clue, as a child holds a cockchafer by a string. Lucien's flight was circumscribed. The words, "He is one of us, he is sound," accidentally overheard but 3 days ago in Mademoiselle des Touches' salon, had turned his head. The Duc de Lenoncourt, the Duc de Navarreins, the Duc de Grandlieu, Rastignac, Blondet, the lovely Duchesse de Maufrigneuse, the Comte d'Esgrignon, and des Lupeaulx, all the most influential people at court, in fact, had congratulated him on his conversion, and completed his intoxication. "Then there is no more to be said," d'Arthez rejoined. "You, of all men, will find it hard to keep clean hands and self-respect. I know you, Lucien. You will feel it acutely when you are despised by the very men to whom you offer yourself." The three took leave, and not one of them gave him a friendly handshake. Lucien was thoughtful and sad for a few minutes. "Oh, never mind those ninnies!" cried Coralie, springing upon his knee and putting her beautiful arms about his neck. "They take life seriously, and life is a joke. Besides, you are going to be Count Lucien de Rubempre. I will wheedle the Chancellerie if there is no other way. I know how to come round that rake of a des Lupeaulx, who will sign your patent. Did I not tell you, Lucien, that at the last you should have Coralie's dead body for a stepping stone?" Next day, Lucien allowed his name to appear in the list of contributors to the Réveil. His name was announced in the prospectus with a flourish of trumpets, and the ministry took care that 100,000 copies should be scattered abroad far and wide. There was a dinner at Robert's, 2 doors away from Frascati's, to celebrate the inauguration, and the whole band of royalist writers for the press were present. Martainville was there, and Auger and Destains, and a host of others, still living, who did monarchy and religion, to use the familiar expression coined for them. Nathan had also enlisted under the banner, for he was thinking of starting a theatre, and not unreasonably held that it was better to have the licensing authorities for him than against him. "We will pay the Liberals out," cried Merlin. "Gentlemen," said Nathan, "if we are for war, let us have war in earnest. We must not carry it on with pop guns. Let us fall upon all classicals and liberals without distinction of age or sex, and put them all to the sword with ridicule. There must be no quarter. We must act honorably. There must be no bribing with copies of books or presents, no taking money of publishers. We must inaugurate a restoration of journalism. Good, said Martinville. Justum et tenacem propositi virum. Let us be implacable and virulent. I will give out Lafayette for the prince of harlequins that he is. And I will undertake the heroes of the Constitutionnel, added Lucien. Sergeant Mercier, Monsieur Jouy's complete works, and the illustrious orators of the left. A war of extermination was unanimously resolved upon, and by 1 o'clock in the morning all shades of opinion were merged and drowned, together with every glimmer of sense, in a flaming bowl of punch. "We have had a fine monarchical and religious jollification," remarked an illustrious reveller in the doorway as he went. That comment appeared in the next day's issue of the Miroir, through the good offices of a publisher among the guests, and became historic. Lucien was supposed to be the traitor who blabbed. His defection gave the signal for a terrific hubbub in the Liberal camp. Lucien was the butt of the opposition newspapers, and ridiculed unmercifully. The whole history of his sonnets was given to the public. Dauriat was said to prefer a first loss of 1,000 crowns to the risk of publishing the verses. Lucien was called the poet sans sonnets, and one morning, in that very paper in which he had so brilliant a beginning, he read the following lines, significant enough for him, but barely intelligible to other readers. If Monsieur Dauriat persistently withholds the sonnets of the future Petrarch from publication, we will act like generous foes. We will open our own columns to his poems, which must be piquant indeed, to judge by the following specimen obligingly communicated by a friend of the author. And close upon that ominous preface followed a sonnet entitled The Thistle, Le Chardon. A chance-come seedling, springing up one day among the flowers in a garden fair, made boast that splendid colours bright and rare its claims to lofty lineage should display. So for a while they suffered it to stay, but with such insolence it flourished there, that, out of patience with its braggart's air, they bade it prove its claims without delay. It bloomed forthwith, but ne'er was blundering clown upon the boards more promptly hooted down. The sister flowers began to jeer and laugh. The owner flung it out. At close of day a solitary jackass came to bray, a common thistle's fitting epitaph. Lucien read the words through scalding tears. Vernou touched elsewhere on Lucien's gambling propensities, and spoke of the forthcoming Archer of Charles IX as anti-national in its tendency, the writer siding with Chapter 28 of A Distinguished Provincial at Paris by Honoré De Balzac, translated by Ella Marriage. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Bruce Peary. Chapter 28. Another week found the quarrel embittered. Lucien had counted upon his friend Etienne. Etienne owed him 1,000 francs, and there had been besides a private understanding between them. But Etienne Lousteau during the interval became his sworn foe, and this was the manner of it. For the past 3 months, Nathan had been smitten with Florine's charms, and much at a loss how to rid himself of Lousteau, his rival, who was in fact dependent upon the actress. And now came Nathan's opportunity, when Florine was frantic with distress over the failure of the Panorama Dramatique, which left her without an engagement. He went as Lucien's colleague to beg Coralie to ask for a part for Florine in a play of his which was about to be produced at the Gymnase. Then Nathan went to Florine and made capital with her out of the service done by the promise of a conditional engagement. Ambition turned Florine's head. She did not hesitate. She had had time to gauge Lousteau pretty thoroughly. Lousteau's courses were weakening his will, and here was Nathan with his ambitions in politics and literature, and energies strong as his cravings. Florine proposed to reappear on the stage with renewed éclat, so she handed over Matifat's correspondence to Nathan. Nathan drove a bargain for them with Matifat, and took the 6th share of Finot's review in exchange for the compromising billets. After this, Florine was installed in sumptuously furnished apartments in the Rue Hauteville, where she took Nathan for her protector in the face of the theatrical and journalistic world. Lousteau was terribly overcome. He wept towards the close of a dinner given by his friends to console him in his affliction. In the course of that banquet it was decided that Nathan had not acted unfairly. Several writers present, Finot and Vernou, for instance, knew of Florine's fervid admiration for dramatic literature, but they all agreed that Lucien had behaved very ill when he arranged that business at the Gymnase. He had indeed broken the most sacred laws of friendship. Party spirit and zeal to serve his new friends had led the royalist poet on to sin beyond forgiveness. Nathan was carried away by passion, pronounced Bixiou, while this distinguished provincial, as Blondet calls him, is simply scheming for his own selfish ends. And so it came to pass that deep plots were laid by all parties alike to rid themselves of this little upstart intruder of a poet who wanted to eat everybody up. Vernou bore Lucien a personal grudge, and undertook to keep a tight hand on him, and Finot declared that Lucien had betrayed the secret of the combination against Matifat, and thereby swindled him, Finot, out of 50,000 francs. Nathan, acting on Florine's advice, gained Finot's support by selling him the 6th share for 15,000 francs, and Lousteau consequently lost his commission. His 1,000 crowns had vanished away. He could not forgive Lucien for this treacherous blow, as he supposed it, dealt to his interests. The wounds of vanity refuse to heal if oxide of silver gets into them. No words, no amount of description can depict the wrath of an author in a paroxysm of mortified vanity, nor the energy which he discovers when stung by the poisoned darts of sarcasm. But, on the other hand, the man that is roused to fighting fury by a personal attack usually subsides very promptly. The more phlegmatic race, who take these things quietly, lay their account with the oblivion which speedily overtakes the spiteful article. These are the truly courageous men of letters, and if the weaklings seem at first to be the strong men, they cannot hold out for any length of time. During that first fortnight, while the fury was upon him, Lucien poured a perfect hailstorm of articles into the Royalist papers, in which he shared the responsibilities of criticism with Hector Merlin. He was always in the breach, pounding away with all his might in the Réveil, backed up by Martainville, the only one among his associates who stood by him without an afterthought. Martainville was not in the secret of certain understandings made and ratified amid after-dinner jokes, or at Dauriat's in the Wooden Galleries, or behind the scenes at the Vaudeville, when journalists of either side met on neutral ground. When Lucien went to the green room of the Vaudeville, he met with no welcome. The men of his own party held out a hand to shake, the others cut him, and all the while Hector Merlin and Théodore Gaillard fraternized unblushingly with Finot, Lousteau, and Vernou, and the rest of the journalists who were known for good fellows. The green room of the Vaudeville in those days was a hotbed of gossip, as well as a neutral ground where men of every shade of opinion could meet. So much so that the president of a court of law, after reproving a learned brother in a certain council chamber for sweeping the green room with his gown, met the subject of his strictures, gown to gown, in the green room of the Vaudeville. Lousteau, in time, shook hands again with Nathan. Finot came thither almost every evening, and Lucien, whenever he could spare the time, went to the Vaudeville to watch the enemies, who showed no sign of relenting towards the unfortunate boy. In the time of the Restoration, party hatred was far more bitter than in our day. Intensity of feeling is diminished in our high-pressure age. The critic cuts a book to pieces and shakes hands with the author afterwards, and the victim must keep on good terms with his slaughterer, or run the gauntlet of innumerable jokes at his expense. If he refuses, he is unsociable, eaten up with self-love, he is sulky and rancorous, he bears malice, he is a bad bedfellow. Today, let an author receive a treacherous stab in the back, let him avoid the snares set for him with base hypocrisy, and endure the most unhandsome treatment, he must still exchange greetings with his assassin, who, for that matter, claims the esteem and friendship of his victim. Everything can be excused and justified in an age which has transformed vice into virtue and virtue into vice. Good fellowship has come to be the most sacred of our liberties. The representatives of the most opposite opinions courteously blunt the edge of their words and fence with buttoned foils. But in those almost forgotten days, the same theatre could scarcely hold certain royalist and liberal journalists. The most malignant provocation was offered. Glances were like pistol shots. The least spark produced an explosion of quarrel. Who has not heard his neighbor's half-smothered oath on the entrance of some man in the forefront of the battle on the opposing side? There were but two parties, royalists and liberals, classics and romantics. You found the same hatred masquerading in either form, and no longer wondered at the scaffolds of the Convention. Lucien had been a liberal and a hot Voltairian. Now he was a rabid royalist and a romantic. Martainville, the only one among his colleagues who really liked him and stood by him loyally, was more hated by the liberals than any man on the royalist side, and this fact drew down all the hate of the liberals on Lucien's head. Martainville's staunch friendship injured Lucien. Political parties show scanty gratitude to outpost sentinels, and leave leaders of forlorn hopes to their fate. 'Tis a rule of warfare which holds equally good in matters political, to keep with the main body of the army if you mean to succeed. The spite of the small liberal papers fastened at once on the opportunity of coupling the two names, and flung them into each other's arms. Their friendship, real or imaginary, brought down upon them both a series of articles written by pens dipped in gall. Félicien Vernou was furious with jealousy of Lucien's social success, and believed, like all his old associates, in the poet's approaching elevation. The fiction of Lucien's treason was embellished with every kind of aggravating circumstance. He was called Judas the Less, Martainville being Judas the Great, for Martainville was supposed, rightly or wrongly, to have given up the bridge of Pec to the foreign invaders. Lucien said jestingly to des Lupeaulx that he himself surely had given up the Ass's bridge. Lucien's luxurious life, hollow though it was, and founded on expectations, had estranged his friends. They could not forgive him for the carriage, which he had put down. For them he was still rolling about in it, nor yet for the splendors of the Rue de Vendôme, which he had left. All of them felt instinctively that nothing was beyond the reach of this young and handsome poet, with intellect enough and to spare. They themselves had trained him in corruption, and therefore they left no stone unturned to ruin him. Some few days before Coralie's first appearance at the Gymnase, Lucien and Hector Merlin went arm in arm to the Vaudeville. Merlin was scolding his friend for giving a helping hand to Nathan in Florine's affair. "You then and there made two mortal enemies of Lousteau and Nathan," he said. "I gave you good advice, and you took no notice of it. You gave praise, you did them a good turn. You will be well punished for your kindness. Florine and Coralie will never live in peace on the same stage. Both will wish to be first. You can only defend Coralie in our papers. And Nathan not only has a pull as a dramatic author, he can control the dramatic criticism in the Liberal newspapers. He has been a journalist a little longer than you." The words responded to Lucien's inward misgivings. Neither Nathan nor Gaillard was treating him with the frankness which he had a right to expect, but so new a convert could hardly complain. Gaillard utterly confounded Lucien by saying roundly that newcomers must give proofs of their sincerity for some time before their party could trust them. There was more jealousy than he had imagined in the inner circles of royalist and ministerial journalism. The jealousy of curs fighting for a bone is apt to appear in the human species when there is a loaf to divide. There is the same growling and showing of teeth. The same characteristics come out. In every possible way, these writers of articles tried to injure each other with those in power. They brought reciprocal accusations of lukewarm zeal. They invented the most treacherous ways of getting rid of a rival. There had been none of this internecine warfare among the Liberals. They were too far from power, too hopelessly out of favor, and Lucien, amid the inextricable tangle of ambitions, had neither the courage to draw sword and cut the knot, or the patience to unravel it. He could not be the Beaumarchais, the Aretino, the Fréron of his epoch. He was not made of such stuff. He thought of nothing but his one desire, the patent of nobility. For he saw clearly that for him such a restoration meant a wealthy marriage, and, the title once secured, chance and his good looks would do the rest. This was all his plan, and Etienne Lousteau, who had confided so much to him, knew his secret, knew how to deal a death blow to the poet of Angoulême. That very night, as Lucien and Merlin went to the Vaudeville, Etienne had laid a terrible trap into which an inexperienced boy could not but fall. "Here is our handsome Lucien," said Finot, drawing des Lupeaulx in the direction of the poet, and shaking hands with feline amiability. "I cannot think of another example of such rapid success," continued Finot, looking from des Lupeaulx to Lucien. "There are two sorts of success in Paris. There is a fortune in solid cash, which any one can amass, and there is the intangible fortune of connections, position, or a footing in certain circles inaccessible for certain persons, however rich they may be. Now, my friend here—" "Our friend," interposed des Lupeaulx, smiling blandly. "Our friend," repeated Finot, patting Lucien's hand, "has made a brilliant success from this point of view. Truth to tell, Lucien has more in him, more gift, more wit than the rest of us that envy him, and he is enchantingly handsome besides. His old friends cannot forgive him for his success. They call it luck." "Luck of that sort never comes to fools or incapables," said des Lupeaulx. "Can you call Bonaparte's fortune luck, eh? There were a score of applicants for the command of the army in Italy, just as there are 100 young men at this moment who would like to have an entrance to Mademoiselle des Touches' house. People are coupling her name with yours already in society, my dear boy," said des Lupeaulx, clapping Lucien on the shoulder. "Ah, you are in high favor. Madame d'Espard, Madame de Bargeton, and Madame de Montcornet are wild about you. You are going to Madame Firmiani's party to-night, are you not? And to the Duchesse de Grandlieu's rout tomorrow?" "Yes," said Lucien. "Allow me to introduce a young banker to you, a Monsieur du Tillet. You ought to be acquainted. He has contrived to make a great fortune in a short time." Lucien and du Tillet bowed and entered into conversation, and the banker asked Lucien to dinner. Finot and des Lupeaulx, a well-matched pair, knew each other well enough to keep upon good terms. They turned away to continue their chat on one of the sofas in the green room, and left Lucien with du Tillet, Merlin, and Nathan. "By the way, my friend," said Finot, "tell me how things stand. Is there really somebody behind Lucien? For he is the bête noire of my staff, and before allowing them to plot against him, I thought I should like to know whether, in your opinion, it would be better to baffle them and keep well with him." The Master of Requests and Finot looked at each other very closely for a moment or two. "My dear fellow," said des Lupeaulx, "how can you imagine that the Marquise d'Espard, or Chatelet, or Madame de Bargeton, who has procured the Baron's nomination to the prefecture and the title of Count, so as to return in triumph to Angouleme, how can you suppose that any of them will forgive Lucien for his attacks on them? They dropped him down in the Royalist ranks to crush him out of existence. At this moment they are looking round for any excuse for not fulfilling the promises they made to that boy. Help them to some. You will do the greatest possible service to the two women, and some day or other they will remember it. I am in their secrets. I was surprised to find how much they hated the little fellow. This Lucien might have rid himself of his bitterest enemy, Madame de Bargeton, by desisting from his attacks on terms which a woman loves to grant. Do you take me? He is young and handsome. He should have drowned her hate in torrents of love. He would be Comte de Rubempre by this time. The cuttlefish bone would have obtained some sinecure for him, some post in the royal household. Lucien would have made a very pretty reader to Louis XVIII. He might have been librarian somewhere or other, master of requests for a joke, master of revels, what you please. The young fool has missed his chance. Perhaps that is his unpardonable sin. Instead of imposing his conditions, he has accepted them. When Lucien was caught with the bait of the patent of nobility, the Baron Chatelet made a great step. Coralie has been the ruin of that boy. If he had not had the actress for his mistress, he would have turned again to the cuttlefish bone, and he would have had her too. Then we can knock him over? How? Des Lupeaulx asked carelessly. He saw a way of gaining credit with the Marquise d'Espard for this service. He is under contract to write for Lousteau's paper, and we can the better hold him to this agreement because he has not a sou. If we tickle up the Keeper of the Seals with a facetious article and prove that Lucien wrote it, he will consider that Lucien is unworthy of the king's favor. We have a plot on hand, besides. Coralie will be ruined, and our distinguished provincial will lose his head when his mistress is hissed off the stage and left without an engagement. When once the patent is suspended, we will laugh at the victim's aristocratic pretensions and allude to his mother, the nurse, and his father, the apothecary. Lucien's courage is only skin deep. He will collapse. We will send him back to his provinces. Nathan made Florine sell me Matifat's 6th share of the review. I was able to buy. Dauriat and I are the only proprietors now. We might come to an understanding, you and I, and the review might be taken over for the benefit of the court. I stipulated for the restitution of my 6th before I undertook to protect Nathan and Florine. They let me have it, and I must help them, but I wished to know first how Lucien stood. "You deserve your name," said des Lupeaulx. "I like a man of your sort." "Very well. Then can you arrange a definite engagement for Florine?" asked Finot. "Yes, but rid us of Lucien, for Rastignac and de Marsay never wish to hear of him again." "Sleep in peace," returned Finot. "Nathan and Merlin will always have articles ready for Gaillard, who will promise to take them. Lucien will never get a line into the paper. We will cut off his supplies. There is only Martainville's paper left him in which to defend himself and Coralie. What can a single paper do against so many?" "I will let you know the weak points of the ministry, but get Lucien to write that article and hand over the manuscript," said des Lupeaulx, who refrained carefully from informing Finot that Lucien's promised patent was nothing but a joke. When des Lupeaulx had gone, Finot went to Lucien, and taking the good-natured tone which deceives so many victims, he explained that he could not possibly afford to lose his contributor, and at the same time he shrank from taking proceedings which might ruin him with his friends of the other side. Finot himself liked a man who was strong enough to change his opinions. They were pretty sure to come across one another, he and Lucien, and might be mutually helpful in 1,000 little ways. Lucien, besides, needed a sure man in the Liberal party to attack the ultras and men in office who might refuse to help him. "Suppose that they play you false, what will you do?" Finot ended. "Suppose that some minister fancies that he has you fast by the halter of your apostasy, and turns the cold shoulder on you. You will be glad to set on a few dogs to snap at his legs, will you not? Very well. But you have made a deadly enemy of Lousteau, he is thirsting for your blood. You and Felicien are not on speaking terms. I only remain to you. It is a rule of the craft to keep a good understanding with every man of real ability. In the world which you are about to enter, you can do me services in return for mine with the press. But business first. Let me have purely literary articles. They will not compromise you, and we shall have executed our agreement." Lucien saw nothing but good fellowship and a shrewd eye to business in Finot's offer. Finot and des Lupeaulx had flattered him, and he was in good humor. He actually thanked Finot. Ambitious men, like all those who can only make their way by the help of others and of circumstances, are bound to lay their plans very carefully and to adhere very closely to the course of conduct on which they determine. It is a cruel moment in the lives of such aspirants when some unknown power brings the fabric of their fortunes to some severe test, and everything gives way at once. Threads are snapped or entangled, and misfortune appears on every side. Let a man lose his head in the confusion, it is all over with him. But if he can resist this first revolt of circumstances, if he can stand erect until the tempest passes over, or make a supreme effort and reach the serene sphere about the storm, then he is really strong. To every man, unless he is born rich, there comes, sooner or later, his fatal week, as it must be called. For Napoleon, for instance, that week was the retreat from Moscow. It had begun now for Lucien. Social and literary success had come to him too easily. He had had such luck that he was bound to know Chapter 29 of A Distinguished Provincial at Paris by Honoré De Balzac. Translated by Ellen Marriage. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Bruce Peary. Chapter 29. The first blow was the heaviest and the most keenly felt, for it touched Lucien where he thought himself invulnerable, in his heart and his love. Coralie might not be clever, but hers was a noble nature, and she possessed the great actress's faculty of suddenly standing aloof from self. This strange phenomenon is subject, until it degenerates into a habit with long practice, to the caprices of character, and not seldom to an admirable delicacy of feeling in actresses who are still young. Coralie, to all appearance bold and wanton, as the part required, was in reality girlish and timid, and love had wrought in her a revulsion of her woman's heart against the comedian's mask. Art, the supreme art of feigning passion and feeling, had not yet triumphed over nature in her. She shrank before a great audience from the utterance that belongs to love alone. And Coralie suffered besides from another true woman's weakness. She needed success, born stage queen though she was. She could not confront an audience with which she was out of sympathy. She was nervous when she appeared on the stage. A cold reception paralyzed her. Each new part gave her the terrible sensations of a first appearance. Applause produced a sort of intoxication which gave her encouragement without flattering her vanity. At a murmur of dissatisfaction, or before a silent house, she flagged. But a great audience, following attentively, admiringly, willing to be pleased, electrified Coralie. She felt at once in communication with the nobler qualities of all those listeners. She felt that she possessed the power of stirring their souls and carrying them with her. But if this action and reaction of the audience upon the actress reveals the nervous organization of genius, it shows no less clearly the poor child's sensitiveness and delicacy. Lucien had discovered the treasures of her nature, had learned in the past months that this woman who loved him was still so much of a girl. And Coralie was unskilled in the wiles of an actress. She could not fight her own battles, nor protect herself against the machinations of jealousy behind the scenes. Florine was jealous of her, and Florine was as dangerous and depraved as Coralie was simple and generous. Roles must come to find Coralie. She was too proud to implore authors or to submit to dishonoring conditions. She would not give herself to the first journalist who persecuted her with his advances and threatened her with his pen. Genius is rare enough in the extraordinary art of the stage, but genius is only one condition of success among many, and is positively hurtful unless it is accompanied by a genius for intrigue in which Coralie was utterly lacking. Lucien knew how much his friend would suffer on her first appearance at the Gymnase, and was anxious at all costs to obtain a success for her. But all the money remaining from the sale of the furniture and all Lucien's earnings had been sunk in costumes, in the furniture of a dressing-room, and the expenses of a first appearance. A few days later, Lucien made up his mind to a humiliating step for love's sake. He took Fendant and Cavalier's bills, and went to the Golden Cocoon in the Rue des Bourdonnais. He would ask Camusot to discount them. The poet had not fallen so low that he could make this attempt quite coolly. There had been many a sharp struggle first, and the way to that decision had been paved with many dreadful thoughts. Nevertheless, he arrived at last in the dark, cheerless little private office that looked out upon a yard, and found Camusot seated gravely there. This was not Coralie's infatuated adorer, not the easy-natured, indolent, incredulous libertine whom he had known hitherto as Camusot, but a heavy father of a family, a merchant grown old in shrewd expedients of business and respectable virtues, wearing a magistrate's mask of judicial prudery. This Camusot was the cool, business-like head of the firm, surrounded by clerks, green cardboard boxes, pigeonholes, invoices, and samples, and fortified by the presence of a wife and a plainly dressed daughter. Lucien trembled from head to foot as he approached, for the worthy merchant, like the money-lenders, turned cool, indifferent eyes upon him. "Here are 2 or 3 bills, monsieur," he said, standing beside the merchant, who did not rise from his desk. "If you will take them of me, you will oblige me extremely." "You have taken something of me, monsieur," said Camusot. "I do not forget it." On this, Lucien explained Coralie's predicament. He spoke in a low voice, bending to murmur his explanation, so that Camusot could hear the heavy throbbing of the humiliated poet's heart. It was no part of Camusot's plans that Coralie should suffer a check. He listened, smiling to himself over the signatures on the bills, for as a judge at the Tribunal of Commerce he knew how the booksellers stood. But in the end he gave Lucien 4,500 francs for them, stipulating that he should add the formula, "for value received in silks." Lucien went straight to Braulard and made arrangements for a good reception. Braulard promised to come to the dress rehearsal, to determine on the points where his Romans should work their fleshy clappers to bring down the house in applause. Lucien gave the rest of the money to Coralie. He did not tell her how he had come by it, and allayed her anxieties and the fears of Berenice, who was sorely troubled over their daily expenses. Martainville came several times to hear Coralie rehearse, and he knew more of the stage than most men of his time. Several Royalist writers had promised favorable articles. Lucien had not a suspicion of the impending disaster. A fatal event occurred on the evening before Coralie's debut. D'Arthez's book had appeared, and the editor of Merlin's paper, considering Lucien to be the best qualified man on the staff, gave him the book to review. He owed his unlucky reputation to those articles on Nathan's work. There were several men in the office at the time, for all the staff had been summoned. Martainville was explaining that the party warfare with the Liberals must be waged on certain lines. Nathan, Merlin, all the contributors, in fact, were talking of Léon Giraud's paper, and remarking that its influence was the more pernicious because the language was guarded, cool, moderate. People were beginning to speak of the circle in the Rue des Quatre Vents as a second convention. It had been decided that the Royalist papers were to wage a systematic war of extermination against these dangerous opponents, who indeed at a later day were destined to sow the doctrines that drove the Bourbons into exile. But that was only after the most brilliant of Royalist writers had joined them for the sake of a mean revenge. d'Arthez's absolutist opinions were not known. It was taken for granted that he shared the views of his clique. He fell under the same anathema, and he was to be the first victim. His book was to be honored with a slashing article, to use the consecrated formula. Lucien refused to write the article. Great was the commotion among the leading Royalist writers thus met in conclave. Lucien was told plainly that a renegade could not do as he pleased. If it did not suit his views to take the side of the monarchy and religion, he could go back to the other camp. Merlin and Martainville took him aside and begged him, as his friends, to remember that he would simply hand Coralie over to the tender mercies of the Liberal papers, for she would find no champions on the Royalist and ministerial side. Her acting was certain to provoke a hot battle, and the kind of discussion which every actress longs to arouse. "You don't understand it in the least," said Martainville. "If she plays for 3 months amid a crossfire of criticism, she will make 30,000 francs when she goes on tour in the provinces at the end of the season. And here are you about to sacrifice Coralie and your own future, and to quarrel with your own bread and butter, all for a scruple that will always stand in your way, and ought to be got rid of at once." Lucien was forced to choose between d'Arthez and Coralie. His mistress would be ruined unless he dealt his friend a death blow in the Réveil and the great newspaper. Poor poet! He went home with death in his soul, and by the fireside he sat and read that finest production of modern literature. Tears fell fast over it as the pages turned. For a long while he hesitated, but at last he took up the pen and wrote a sarcastic article of the kind that he understood so well, taking the book as children might take some bright bird to strip it of its plumage and torture it. His sardonic jests were sure to tell. Again he turned to the book, and as he read it over a second time, his better self awoke. In the dead of night he hurried across Paris and stood outside d'Arthez's house. He looked up at the windows and saw the faint, pure gleam of light in the panes, as he had so often seen it, with a feeling of admiration for the noble steadfastness of that truly great nature. For some moments he stood irresolute on the curbstone. He had not courage to go further. But his good angel urged him on. He tapped at the door and opened, and found d'Arthez sitting reading in a fireless room. "What has happened?" asked d'Arthez, for news of some dreadful kind was visible in Lucien's ghastly face. "Your book is sublime, d'Arthez," said Lucien, with tears in his eyes, "and they have ordered me to write an attack upon it." "Poor boy, the bread that they give you is hard indeed," said d'Arthez. "I only ask for one favor. Keep my visit a secret, and leave me to my hell, to the occupations of the damned. Perhaps it is impossible to attain to success until the heart is seared and callous in every most sensitive spot." "The same as ever," cried d'Arthez. "Do you think me a base poltroon? No, d'Arthez, no. I am a boy half crazed with love." And he told his story. "Let us look at the article," said d'Arthez, touched by all that Lucien said of Coralie. Lucien held out the manuscript. D'Arthez read, and could not help smiling. "Oh, what a fatal waste of intellect!" he began, but at the sight of Lucien overcome with grief in the opposite armchair, he checked himself. "Will you leave it with me to correct? I will let you have it again tomorrow," he went on. "Flippancy depreciates a work. Serious and conscientious criticism is sometimes praise in itself. I know a way to make your article more honorable both for yourself and for me. Besides, I know my faults well enough." "When you climb a hot, shadowless hillside, you sometimes find fruit to quench your torturing thirst, and I have found it here and now," said Lucien, as he sprang sobbing to d'Arthez's arms and kissed his friend on the forehead. "It seems to me that I am leaving my conscience in your keeping. Some day I will come to you and ask for it again." "I look upon a periodical repentance as a great hypocrisy," d'Arthez said solemnly. "Repentance becomes a sort of indemnity for wrongdoing. Repentance is virginity of the soul, which we must keep for God. A man who repents twice is a horrible sycophant. I am afraid that you regard repentance as absolution." Lucien went slowly back to the Rue de la Lune, stricken dumb by those words. Next morning d'Arthez sent back his article, recast throughout, and Lucien sent it in to the review. But from that day melancholy preyed upon him, and he could not always disguise his mood. That evening, when the theatre was full, he experienced for the first time the paroxysm of nervous terror caused by a debut, terror aggravated in his case by all the strength of his love. Vanity of every kind was involved. He looked over the rows of faces as a criminal eyes the judges and the jury on whom his life depends. A murmur would have set him quivering; any slight incident upon the stage, Coralie's exits and entrances, and the slightest modulation of the tones of her voice, would perturb him beyond all reason. The play in which Coralie made her first appearance at the Gymnase was a piece of the kind which sometimes falls flat at first, and afterwards has immense success. It fell flat that night. Coralie was not applauded when she came on, and the chilly reception reacted upon her. The only applause came from Camusot's box, and various persons posted in the balcony and galleries silenced Camusot with repeated cries of "Hush!" The galleries even silenced the claqueurs when they led off with exaggerated salvos. Martainville applauded bravely. Nathan, Merlin, and the treacherous Florine followed his example, but it was clear that the piece was a failure. A crowd gathered in Coralie's dressing-room and consoled her till she had no courage left. She went home in despair, less for her own sake than for Lucien's. "Braulard has betrayed us," Lucien said. Coralie was heart-stricken. The next day found her in a high fever, utterly unfit to play, face to face with the thought that she had been cut short in her career. Lucien hid the papers from her and looked them over in the dining-room. The reviewers, one and all, attributed the failure of the piece to Coralie. She had overestimated her strength. She might be the delight of a boulevard audience, but she was out of her element at the Gymnase. She had been inspired by a laudable ambition, but she had not taken her powers into account. She had chosen a part to which she was quite unequal. Lucien read on through a pile of penny-a-lining, put together on the same system as his attack upon Nathan. Milo of Crotona, when he found his hands fast in the oak which he himself had cleft, was not more furious than Lucien. He grew haggard with rage. His friends gave Coralie the most treacherous advice, in the language of kindly counsel and friendly interest. She should play, according to these authorities, all kinds of roles, which the treacherous writers of these unblushing feuilletons knew to be utterly unsuited to her genius. And these were the Royalist papers, led off by Nathan. As for the Liberal press, all the weapons which Lucien had used were now turned against him. Coralie heard a sob, followed by another and another. She sprang out of bed to find Lucien, and saw the papers. Nothing would satisfy her but she must read them all, and when she had read them, she went back to bed and lay there in silence. Florine was in the plot. She had foreseen the outcome. She had studied Coralie's part, and was ready to take her place. The management, unwilling to give up the piece, was ready to take Florine in Coralie's stead. When the manager came, he found poor Coralie sobbing and exhausted on her bed. But when he began to say, in Lucien's presence, that Florine knew the part, and that the play must be given that evening, Coralie sprang up at once. "I will play," she cried, and sank, fainting, on the floor. So Florine took the part, and made her reputation in it, for the piece succeeded. The newspapers all sang her praises, and from that time forth Florine was the great actress whom we all know. Florine's success exasperated Lucien to the highest degree. "A wretched girl whom you helped to earn her bread! If the Gymnase prefers to do so, let the management pay you to cancel your engagement. I shall be the Comte de Rubempre. I will make my fortune, and you shall be my wife." "What nonsense!" said Coralie, looking at him with wan eyes. "Nonsense?" repeated he. "Very well, wait a few days, and you shall live in a fine house, you shall have a carriage, and I will write a part for you." He took 2,000 francs and hurried to Frascati's. For 7 hours the unhappy victim of the Furies watched his varying luck, and outwardly seemed cool and self-contained. He experienced both extremes of fortune during that day and part of the night that followed. At one time he possessed as much as 30,000 francs, and he came out, at last, without a sou. In the Rue de la Lune he found Finot waiting for him with a request for one of his short articles. Lucien so far forgot himself that he complained. "Oh, it is not all rosy," returned Finot. "You made your right-about face in such a way that you were bound to lose the support of the Liberal press, and the Liberals are far stronger in print than all the Ministerialist and Royalist papers put together. A man should never leave one camp for another until he has made a comfortable berth for himself, by way of consolation for the losses that he must expect. And in any case, a prudent politician will see his friends first, and give them his reasons for going over, and take their opinions. You can still act together, they sympathize with you, and you agree to give mutual help. Nathan and Merlin did that before they went over. Hawks don't pike out hawks' eyes. You were as innocent as a lamb. You will be forced to show your teeth to your new party to make anything out of them. You have been necessarily sacrificed to Nathan. I cannot conceal from you that your article on d'Arthez has roused a terrific hubbub. Marat is a saint compared with you. You will be attacked, and your book will be a failure. How far have things gone with your romance?" "These are the last proof sheets." All the anonymous articles against that young d'Arthez in the Ministerialist and Ultra papers are set down to you. The Réveil is poking fun at the set in the Rue des Quatre Vents, and the hits are the more telling because they are funny. There is a whole serious political coterie at the back of Léon Giraud's paper. They will come into power, too, sooner or later. I have not written a line in the Réveil this week past. Very well. Keep my short articles in mind. Write 50 of them straight off, and I will pay you for them in a lump. But they must be of the same color as the paper. And Finot, with seeming carelessness, gave Lucien an edifying anecdote of the Keeper of the Seals, a piece of current gossip, he said, for the subject of one of the papers. Eager to retrieve his losses at play, Lucien shook off his dejection, summoned up his energy and youthful force, and wrote 30 articles of 2 columns each. These finished, he went to Dauriat's, partly because he felt sure of meeting Finot there, and he wished to give the articles to Finot in person, partly because he wished for an explanation of the non-appearance of the Marguerite. He found the bookseller's shop full of his enemies. All the talk immediately ceased as he entered. Put under the ban of journalism, his courage rose, and once more he said to himself, as he had said in the alley at the Luxembourg, "I will triumph." Dauriat was neither amiable or inclined to patronize. He was sarcastic in tone, and determined not to bate an inch of his rights. The Marguerite should appear when it suited his purpose. He should wait until Lucien was in a position to secure the success of the book. It was his, he had bought it outright. When Lucien asserted that Dauriat was bound to publish the Marguerite by the very nature of the contract and the relative positions of the parties to the agreement, Dauriat flatly contradicted him, said that no publisher could be compelled by law to publish at a loss, and that he himself was the best judge of the expediency of producing the book. There was, besides, a remedy open to Lucien, as any court of law would admit. The poet was quite welcome to take his verses to a royalist publisher upon the repayment of 1,000 crowns. Lucien went away. Dauriat's moderate tone had exasperated him even more than his previous arrogance at their first interview. So the Marguerite would not appear until Lucien had found a host of formidable supporters, or grown formidable himself. He walked home slowly, so oppressed and out of heart that he felt ready for suicide. Coralie lay in bed, looking white and ill. "She must have a part, or she will die," said Berenice, as Lucien dressed for a great evening party at Mademoiselle des Touches' house in the Rue de Mont Blanc. Des Lupeaulx and Vignon and Blondet were to be there, as well as Madame d'Espard and Madame de Bargeton. The party was given in honor of Conti, the great composer, owner likewise of one of the most famous voices off the stage. Cinti, Pasta, Garcia, Levasseur, and 2 or 3 celebrated amateurs in society not excepted. Lucien saw the Marquise, her cousin, and Madame de Montcornet sitting together, and made one of the party. The unhappy young fellow, to all appearances, was light-hearted, happy, and content. He jested. He was the Lucien de Rubempre of his days of splendor. He would not seem to need help from anyone. He dwelt on his services to the Royalist party, and cited the hue and cry raised after him by the Liberal press as a proof of his zeal. "And you will be well rewarded, my friend," said Madame de Bargeton with a gracious smile. "Go to the Chancellerie the day after tomorrow with the Heron and des Lupeaulx, and you will find your patent signed by His Majesty. The Keeper of the Seals will take it tomorrow to the Tuileries, but there is to be a meeting of the Council, and he will not come back till late. Still, if I hear the result tomorrow evening, I will let you know. Where are you living?" "I will come to you," said Lucien, ashamed to confess that he was living in the Rue de la Lune. "The Duc de Lenoncourt and the Duc de Navarreins have made mention of you to the King," added the Marquise. "They praised your absolute and entire devotion, and said that some distinction ought to avenge your treatment in the Liberal press. The name and title of Rubempre, to which you have a claim through your mother, would become illustrious through you, they said. The King gave his lordship instructions that evening to prepare a patent authorizing the Sieur Lucien Chardon to bear the arms and title of the Comte de Rubempre, as grandson of the last Count by the mother's side. Let us favor the songsters, Chardonnerets, of Pindus, said His Majesty, after reading your sonnet on the lily, which my cousin luckily remembered to give the Duke, especially when the King can work miracles and change the songbird into an eagle, Monsieur de Navarreins replied. Lucien's expansion of feeling would have softened the heart of any woman less deeply wounded than Louise d'Espard de Negrepelisse, but her thirst for vengeance was only increased by Lucien's graciousness. Des Lupeaulx was right. Lucien was wanting in tact. It never crossed his mind that this history of the patent was one of the mystifications at which Madame d'Espard was an adept. Emboldened with success and the flattering distinction shown to him by Mademoiselle des Touches, he stayed till 2 o'clock in the morning for a word in private with his hostess. Lucien had learned, in Royalist newspaper offices, that Mademoiselle des Touches was the author of a play in which La Petite Fay, the marvel of the moment, was about to appear. As the rooms emptied, he drew Mademoiselle des Touches to a sofa in the boudoir, and told the story of Coralie's misfortune and his own so touchingly that Mademoiselle des Touches promised to give the heroine's part to his friend. That promise put new life into Coralie. But the next day, as they breakfasted together, Lucien opened Lousteau's newspaper and found that unlucky anecdote of the Keeper of the Seals and his wife. The story was full of the blackest malice lurking in the most caustic wit. Louis XVIII was brought into the story in a masterly fashion and held up to ridicule in such a way that prosecution was impossible. Here is the substance of a fiction for which the Liberal party attempted to win credence, though they only succeeded in adding one more to the tale of their ingenious calumnies. The King's passion for pink-scented notes and a correspondence full of madrigals and sparkling wit was declared to be the last phase of the tender passion. Love had reached the doctrinaire stage, or had passed, in other words, from the concrete to the abstract. The illustrious lady, so cruelly ridiculed under the name of Octavie by Béranger, had conceived, so it was said, the gravest fears. The correspondence was languishing. The more Octavie displayed her wit, the cooler grew the royal lover. At last Octavie discovered the cause of her decline. Her power was threatened by the novelty and piquancy of a correspondence between the august scribe and the wife of his Keeper of the Seals. That excellent woman was believed to be incapable of writing a note, She was simply and solely godmother to the efforts of audacious ambition. Who could be hidden behind her petticoats? Octavie decided, after making observations of her own, that the king was corresponding with his minister. She laid her plans. With the help of a faithful friend, she arranged that a stormy debate should detain the minister at the Chamber. Then she contrived to secure a tete-a-tete, and to convince outraged Majesty of the fraud. Louis XVIII flew into a royal and truly Bourbon passion, but the tempest broke on Octavie's head. He would not believe her. Octavie offered immediate proof, begging the king to write a note which must be answered at once. The unlucky wife of the Keeper of the Seals sent to the Chamber for her husband, but precautions had been taken, and at that moment the minister was on his legs addressing the Chamber. The lady racked her brains and replied to the note with such intellect as she could improvise. "Your chancellor will supply the rest," cried Octavie, laughing at the king's chagrin. There was not a word of truth in the story, but it struck home to three persons: the Keeper of the Seals, his wife, and the king. It was said that des Lupeaulx had invented the tale, but Finot always kept his counsel. The article was caustic and clever, the Liberal papers and the Orleanists were delighted with it, and Lucien himself laughed, and thought of it merely as a very amusing canard. Chapter 30 of A Distinguished Provincial at Paris by Honoré De Balzac. Translated by Ellen Marriage. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Bruce Peary. Chapter 30. Lucien called next day for des Lupeaulx and the Baron du Châtelet. The Baron had just been to thank his lordship. The Sieur Châtelet, newly appointed Councillor Extraordinary, was now Comte du Châtelet, with a promise of the prefecture of the Charente so soon as the present prefect should have completed the term of office necessary to receive the maximum retiring pension. The Comte du Châtelet, for the du had been inserted in the patent, drove with Lucien to the Chancellerie and treated his companion as an equal. But for Lucien's articles, he said, his patent would not have been granted so soon. Liberal persecution had been a stepping-stone to advancement. Des Lupeaulx was waiting for them in the Secretary-General's office. That functionary started with surprise when Lucien appeared and looked at des Lupeaulx. "What!" he exclaimed, to Lucien's utter bewilderment. "Do you dare to come here, sir? Your patent was made out, but his lordship has torn it up. Here it is." The Secretary-General caught up the first torn sheet that came to hand. "The minister wished to discover the author of yesterday's atrocious article, and here is the manuscript," added the speaker, holding out the sheets of Lucien's article. "You call yourself a royalist, sir, and you are on the staff of that detestable paper which turns the minister's hair gray, harasses the Centre, and is dragging the country headlong to ruin. You breakfast on the Corsaire, the Miroir, the Constitutionnel, and the Courrier. You dine on the Quotidienne and the Réveil, and then sup with Martainville, the worst enemy of the government. Martainville urges the government on to absolutist measures. He is more likely to bring on another revolution than if he had gone over to the extreme left. You are a very clever journalist, but you will never make a politician. The minister denounced you to the king, and the king was so angry that he scolded Monsieur le Duc de Navarreins, his first gentleman of the bedchamber. Your enemies will be all the more formidable because they have hitherto been your friends. Conduct that one expects from an enemy is atrocious in a friend." "Why, really, my dear fellow, are you a child?" said des Lupeaulx. You have compromised me. Madame d'Espard, Madame de Bargeton, and Madame de Montcornet, who were responsible for you, must be furious. The Duke is sure to have handed on his annoyance to the Marquise, and the Marquise will have scolded her cousin. Keep away from them, and wait." "Here comes his lordship. Go," said the Secretary-General. Lucien went out into the Place Vendôme. He was stunned by this bludgeon blow. He walked home along the boulevards, trying to think over his position. He saw himself a plaything in the hands of envy, treachery, and greed. What was he in this world of contending ambitions? A child, sacrificing everything to the pursuit of pleasure and the gratification of vanity. A poet whose thoughts never went beyond the moment, a moth flitting from one bright gleaming object to another. He had no definite aim, he was the slave of circumstance, meaning well, doing ill. Conscience tortured him remorselessly, and to crown it all, he was penniless, and exhausted with work and emotion. His articles could not compare with Merlin's or Nathan's work. He walked at random, absorbed in these thoughts. As he passed some of the reading rooms, which were already lending books as well as newspapers, a placard caught his eyes. It was an advertisement of a book with a grotesque title, but beneath the announcement he saw his name in brilliant letters, by Lucien Chardon de Rubempre. So his book had come out, and he had heard nothing of it. All the newspapers were silent. He stood motionless before the placard, his arms hanging at his sides. He did not notice a little knot of acquaintances, Rastignac and de Marsay and some other fashionable young men, nor did he see that Michel Chrestien and Léon Giraud were coming towards him. "Are you Monsieur Chardon?" It was Michel who spoke, and there was that in the sound of his voice that set Lucien's heartstrings vibrating. "Do you not know me?" he asked, turning very pale. Michel spat in his face. "Take that as your wages for your article against d'Arthez. If everybody would do as I do on his own or his friend's behalf, the press would be as it ought to be, a self-respecting and respected priesthood." Lucien staggered back and caught hold of Rastignac. "Gentlemen," he said, addressing Rastignac and de Marsay, "you will not refuse to act as my seconds. But first, I wish to make matters even and apology impossible." He struck Michel a sudden unexpected blow in the face. The rest rushed in between the Republican and Royalist to prevent a street brawl. Rastignac dragged Lucien off to the Rue Taitbout, only a few steps away from the Boulevard de Gand, where this scene took place. It was the hour of dinner, or a crowd would have assembled at once. De Marsay came to find Lucien, and the pair insisted that he should dine with them at the Café Anglais, where they drank and made merry. "Are you a good swordsman?" inquired de Marsay. "I have never had a foil in my hands." "A good shot?" "Never fired a pistol in my life." "Then you have luck on your side. You are a formidable antagonist to stand up to. You may kill your man," said de Marsay. Fortunately, Lucien found Coralie in bed and asleep. She had played, without rehearsal, in a one-act play, and taken her revenge. She had met with genuine applause. Her enemies had not been prepared for this step on her part, and her success had determined the manager to give her the heroine's part in Camille Maupin's play. He had discovered the cause of her apparent failure, and was indignant with Florine and Nathan. Coralie should have the protection of the management. At 5 o'clock that morning, Rastignac came for Lucien. "The name of your street, my dear fellow, is particularly appropriate for your lodgings. You are up in the sky," he said, by way of greeting. Let us be first upon the ground on the road to Clignancourt. It is good form, and we ought to set them an example." "Here is the programme," said de Marsay, as the cab rattled through the Faubourg Saint-Denis. "You stand up at 25 paces, coming nearer till you are only 15 apart. You have, each of you, 5 paces to take and 3 shots to fire, no more. Whatever happens, that must be the end of it. We load for your antagonist, and his seconds load for you. The weapons were chosen by the 4 seconds at a gunmaker's. We helped you to a chance, I will promise you. Horse pistols are to be the weapons." For Lucien, life had become a bad dream. He did not care whether he lived or died. The courage of suicide helped him, in some sort, to carry things off with a dash of bravado before the spectators. He stood in his place. He would not take a step, a piece of recklessness which the others took for deliberate calculation. They thought the poet an uncommonly cool hand. Michel Chrestien came as far as his limit. Both fired twice and at the same time, for either party was considered to be equally insulted. Michel's first bullet grazed Lucien's chin. Lucien's passed 10 feet above Chrestien's head. The second shot hit Lucien's coat collar, but the buckram lining fortunately saved its wearer. The third bullet struck him in the chest, and he dropped. "Is he dead?" asked Michel Chrestien. "No," said the surgeon, "he will pull through." "So much the worse," answered Michel. "Yes, so much the worse," said Lucien, as his tears fell fast. By noon the unhappy boy lay in bed in his own room. With untold pains they had managed to remove him, but it had taken 5 hours to bring him to the Rue de la Lune. His condition was not dangerous, but precautions were necessary lest fever should set in and bring about troublesome complications. Coralie choked down her grief and anguish. She sat up with him at night through the anxious weeks of his illness, studying her parts by his bedside. Lucien was in danger for 2 long months, and often at the theatre Coralie acted her frivolous rôle with one thought in her heart: perhaps he is dying at this moment. Lucien owed his life to the skill and devotion of a friend whom he had grievously hurt. Bianchon had come to tend him after hearing the story of the attack from d'Arthez, who told it in confidence and excused the unhappy poet. Bianchon suspected that d'Arthez was generously trying to screen the renegade, but on questioning Lucien during a lucid interval in the dangerous nervous fever, he learned that his patient was only responsible for the one serious article in Hector Merlin's paper. Before the first month was out, the firm of Fendant and Cavalier filed their schedule. Bianchon told Coralie that Lucien must on no account hear the news. The famous Archer of Charles IX, brought out with an absurd title, had been a complete failure. Fendant, being anxious to realize a little ready money before going into bankruptcy, had sold the whole edition, without Cavalier's knowledge, to dealers in printed paper. These, in their turn, had disposed of it at a cheap rate to hawkers, and Lucien's book at that moment was adorning the bookstalls along the quays. The booksellers on the Quai des Augustins, who had previously taken a quantity of copies, now discovered that after this sudden reduction of the price, they were like to lose heavily on their purchases. The 4 duodecimo volumes, for which they had paid 4 francs 50 centimes, were being given away for 50 sous. Great was the outcry in the trade, but the newspapers preserved a profound silence. Barbet had not foreseen this clearance. He had a belief in Lucien's abilities. For once he had broken his rule and taken 200 copies. The prospect of a loss drove him frantic. The things he said of Lucien were fearful to hear. Then Barbet took a heroic resolution. He stocked his copies in a corner of his shop with the obstinacy of greed, and left his competitors to sell their wares at a loss. 2 years afterwards, when d'Arthez's fine preface, the merits of the book, and 1 or 2 articles by Léon Giraud had raised the value of the book, Barbet sold his copies, one by one, at 10 francs each. Lucien knew nothing of all this, but Berenice and Coralie could not refuse to allow Hector Merlin to see his dying comrade, and Hector Merlin made him drink, drop by drop, the whole of the bitter draught brewed by the failure of Fendant and Cavalier, made bankrupts by his first ill-fated book. Martainville, the one friend who stood by Lucien through thick and thin, had written a magnificent article on his work. But so great was the general exasperation against the editor of L'Aristarque, L'Oriflamme, and Le Drapeau Blanc, that his championship only injured Lucien. In vain did the athlete return the liberal insults tenfold. Not a newspaper took up the challenge in spite of all his attacks. Coralie, Berenice, and Bianchon might shut the door on Lucien's so-called friends, who raised a great outcry, but it was impossible to keep out creditors and writs. After the failure of Fendant and Cavalier, their bills were taken into bankruptcy, according to that provision of the Code of Commerce most inimical to the claims of third parties, who in this way lose the benefit of delay. Lucien discovered that Camusot was proceeding against him with great energy. When Coralie heard the name, and for the first time learned the dreadful and humiliating step which her poet had taken for her sake, the angelic creature loved him 10 times more than before, and would not approach Camusot. The bailiff bringing the warrant of arrest shrank back from the idea of dragging his prisoner out of bed, and went back to Camusot before applying to the president of the Tribunal of Commerce for an order to remove the debtor to a private hospital. Camusot hurried at once to the Rue de la Lune, and Coralie went down to him. When she came up again, she held the warrants, in which Lucien was described as a tradesman, in her hand. How had she obtained those papers from Camusot? What promise had she given? Coralie kept a sad, gloomy silence, but when she returned, she looked as if all the life had gone out of her. She played in Camille Maupin's play, and contributed not a little to the success of that illustrious literary hermaphrodite, but the creation of this character was the last flicker of a bright dying lamp. On the 20th night, when Lucien had so far recovered that he had regained his appetite and could walk abroad, and talked of getting to work again, Coralie broke down. A secret trouble was weighing upon her. Berenice always believed that she had promised to go back to Camusot to save Lucien. Another mortification followed. Coralie was obliged to see her part given to Florine. Nathan had threatened the Gymnase with war if the management refused to give the vacant place to Coralie's rival. Coralie had persisted till she could play no longer, knowing that Florine was waiting to step into her place. She had overtasked her strength. The Gymnase had advanced sums during Lucien's illness. She had no money to draw. Lucien, eager to work though he was not yet strong enough to write, and he helped, besides, to nurse Coralie and to relieve Berenice. From poverty they had come to utter distress, but in Bianchon they found a skilful and devoted doctor, who obtained credit for them of the druggist. The landlord of the house and the tradespeople knew by this time how matters stood. The furniture was attached. The tailor and dressmaker no longer stood in awe of the journalist, and proceeded to extremes. And at last no one, with the exception of the pork butcher and the druggist, gave the two unlucky children credit. For a week or more all three of them, Lucien, Berenice, and the invalid, were obliged to live on the various ingenious preparations sold by the pork butcher. The inflammatory diet was little suited to the sick girl, and Coralie grew worse. Sheer want compelled Lucien to ask Lousteau for a return of the loan of 1,000 francs lost at play by the friend who had deserted him in his hour of need. Perhaps, amid all his troubles, this step cost him most cruel suffering. Lousteau was not to be found in the Rue de la Harpe. Hunted down like a hare, he was lodging now with this friend, now with that. Lucien found him at last at Flicoteaux's. He was sitting at the very table at which Lucien had found him that evening when, for his misfortune, he forsook d'Arthez for journalism. Lousteau offered him dinner, and Lucien accepted the offer. As they came out of Flicoteaux's with Claude Vignon, who happened to be dining there that day, and the great man in obscurity who kept his wardrobe at Saint-Manon's, the four among them could not produce enough specie to pay for a cup of coffee at the Café Voltaire. They lounged about the Luxembourg in the hope of meeting with a publisher, and, as it fell out, they met with one of the most famous printers of the day. Lousteau borrowed 40 francs of him, and divided the money into 4 equal parts. Misery had brought down Lucien's pride and extinguished sentiment. He shed tears as he told the story of his troubles, but each one of his comrades had a tale as cruel as his own, and when the 3 versions had been given, it seemed to the poet that he was the least unfortunate among the 4. All of them craved a respite. Chapter 31 of A Distinguished Provincial at Paris by Honoré De Balzac, translated by Ellen Marriage. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Bruce Peary. Chapter 31. Lousteau hurried to the Palais Royal to gamble with his remaining 9 francs. The great man unknown to fame, though he had a divine mistress, must needs hie him to a low haunt of vice to wallow in perilous pleasure. Vignon betook himself to the Rocher de Cancale to drown memory and thought in a couple of bottles of Bordeaux. Lucien parted company with him on the threshold, declining to share that supper. When he shook hands with the one journalist who had not been hostile to him, it was with a cruel pang in his heart. "What shall I do?" he asked aloud. "One must do as one can," the great critic said. "Your book is good, but it excited jealousy, and your struggle will be long and hard. Genius is a cruel disease. Every writer carries a canker in his heart, a devouring monster, like the tapeworm in the stomach, which destroys all feeling as it arises in him. Which is the stronger, the man or the disease? One has need to be a great man, truly, to keep the balance between genius and character. The talent grows, the heart withers. Unless a man is a giant, unless he has the thews of a Hercules, he must be content either to lose his gift or to live without a heart. You are slender and fragile. You will give way," he added as he turned into the restaurant. Lucien returned home, thinking over that terrible verdict. He beheld the life of literature by the light of the profound truths uttered by Vignon. "Money, money," a voice cried in his ears. Then he drew 3 bills of 1,000 francs each, due respectively in 1, 2, and 3 months, imitating the handwriting of his brother-in-law, David Séchard, with admirable skill. He endorsed the bills, and took them next morning to Métivier, the paper dealer in the Rue Serpente, who made no difficulty about taking them. Lucien wrote a few lines to give his brother-in-law notice of this assault upon his cash-box, promising, as usual in such cases, to be ready to meet the bills as they fell due. When all debts, his own and Coralie's, were paid, he put the 300 francs which remained into Berenice's hands, bidding her to refuse him money if he asked her for it. He was afraid of a return of the gambler's frenzy. Lucien worked away gloomily in a sort of cold, speechless fury, putting forth all his powers into witty articles written by the light of the lamp at Coralie's bedside. Whenever he looked up in search of ideas, his eyes fell on that beloved face, white as porcelain, fair with the beauty that belongs to the dying, and he saw a smile on her pale lips, and her eyes, grown bright with a more consuming pain than physical suffering, always turned on his face. Lucien sent in his work, but he could not leave the house to worry editors, and his articles did not appear. When he at last made up his mind to go to the office, he met with a cool reception from Theodore Gaillard, who had advanced him money, and turned his literary diamonds to good account afterwards. "Take care, my dear fellow, you are falling off," he said. "You must not let yourself down. Your work wants inspiration." "That little Lucien has written himself out with his romance and his first articles," cried Félicien Vernou, Merlin, and the whole chorus of his enemies, whenever his name came up at Dauriat's or the Vaudeville. "The work he is sending us is pitiable." To have written oneself out, in the slang of journalism, is a verdict very hard to live down. It passed everywhere from mouth to mouth, ruining Lucien, all unsuspicious as he was. And indeed his burdens were too heavy for his strength. In the midst of a heavy strain of work, he was sued for the bills which he had drawn in David Séchard's name. He had recourse to Camusot's experience, and Coralie's sometime adorer was generous enough to assist the man she loved. The intolerable situation lasted for 2 whole months, the days being diversified by stamped papers handed over to Desroches, a friend of Bixiou, Blondet, and des Lupeaulx. Early in August, Bianchon told them that Coralie's condition was hopeless. She had only a few days to live. Those days were spent in tears by Berenice and Lucien. They could not hide their grief from the dying girl, and she was broken-hearted for Lucien's sake. Some strange change was working in Coralie. She would have Lucien bring a priest. She must be reconciled to the Church, and die in peace. Coralie died as a Christian. Her repentance was sincere. Her agony and death took all energy and heart out of Lucien. He sank into a low chair at the foot of the bed, and never took his eyes off her till death brought the end of her suffering. It was 5 o'clock in the morning. Some singing bird, lighting upon a flower-pot on the window-sill, twittered a few notes. Berenice, kneeling by the bedside, was covering a hand fast growing cold with kisses and tears. On the chimney-piece there lay 11 sous. Lucien went out. Despair made him beg for money to lay Coralie in her grave. He had wild thoughts of flinging himself at the Marquise d'Espard's feet, of entreating the Comte du Châtelet, Madame de Bargeton, Mademoiselle des Touches, nay, that terrible dandy of a de Marsay. All his pride had gone with his strength. He would have enlisted as a common soldier at that moment for money. He walked on with a slouching, feverish gait known to all the unhappy, reached Camille Maupin's house, entered, careless of his disordered dress, and sent in a message. He entreated Mademoiselle des Touches to see him for a moment. "Mademoiselle only went to bed at 3 o'clock this morning," said the servant, "and no one would dare to disturb her until she rings." "When does she ring?" "Never before 10 o'clock." Then Lucien wrote one of those harrowing appeals in which the well-dressed beggar flings all pride and self-respect to the winds. One evening, not so very long ago, when Lousteau had told him of the abject begging letters which Finot received, Lucien had thought it impossible that any creature would sink so low, and now, carried away by his pen, he had gone further, it may be, than other unlucky wretches upon the same road. He did not suspect, in his fever and imbecility, that he had just written a masterpiece of pathos. On his way home along the boulevards, he met Barbet. "Barbet," he begged, holding out his hand, 500 francs." "No, 200," returned the other. "Ah, then you have a heart." "Yes, but I am a man of business as well. I have lost a lot of money through you," he concluded, after giving the history of the failure of Fendant and Cavalier. "Will you put me in the way of making some?" Lucien quivered. "You are a poet. You ought to understand all kinds of poetry," continued the little publisher. "I want a few rollicking songs at this moment to put along with some more by different authors, or they will be down upon me over the copyright. I want to have a good collection to sell on the streets at 10 sous. If you care to let me have 10 good drinking songs by tomorrow evening, or something spicy, you know the sort of thing, eh? I will pay you 200 francs." When Lucien returned home, he found Coralie stretched out, straight and stiff, on a pallet bed. Berenice, with many tears, had wrapped her in a coarse linen sheet, and put lighted candles at the four corners of the bed. Coralie's face had taken that strange, delicate beauty of death which so vividly impresses the living with the idea of absolute calm. She looked like some white girl in a decline. It seemed as if those pale crimson lips must open and murmur the name which had blended with the name of God in the last words that she uttered before she died. Lucien told Berenice to order a funeral which should not cost more than 200 francs, including the service at the shabby little church of the Bonne Nouvelle. As soon as she had gone out, he sat down to a table, and, beside the dead body of his love, he composed 10 rollicking songs to fit popular airs. The effort cost him untold anguish, but at last the brain began to work at the bidding of necessity, as if suffering were not. And already Lucien had learned to put Claude Vignon's terrible maxims in practice, and to raise a barrier between heart and brain. What a night the poor boy spent over those drinking songs, writing by the light of the tall wax candles, while the priest recited the prayers for the dead. Morning broke before the last song was finished. Lucien tried it over to a street song of the day, to the consternation of Berenice and the priest, who thought that he was mad. "Lads, 'tis tedious waste of time to mingle song and reason. Folly calls for laughing rhyme, sense is out of season. Let Apollo be forgot when Bacchus fills the drinking cup. Any catch is good, I wot, if good fellows take it up. Let philosophers protest, let us laugh and quaff, and a fig for the rest. As Hippocrates has said, every jolly fellow, when a century has sped, still is fit and mellow. No more following of a lass with the palsy in your legs. While your hand can hold a glass, you can drain it to the dregs with an undiminished zest. Let us laugh and quaff, and a fig for the rest. Whence we come, we know full well. Whither are we going? Ne'er a one of us can tell. 'Tis a thing past knowing. Faith, what does it signify? Take the good that heaven sends. It is certain that we die, certain that we live, my friends. Life is nothing but a jest. Let us laugh and quaff, and a fig for the rest. He was shouting the reckless refrain when d'Arthez and Bianchon arrived, to find him in a paroxysm of despair and exhaustion, utterly unable to make a fair copy of his verses. A torrent of tears followed, and when, amid his sobs, he had told his story, he saw the tears standing in his friend's eyes. "This wipes out many sins," said d'Arthez. "Happy are they who suffer for their sins in this world," the priest said solemnly. At the sight of the fair dead face smiling at eternity, while Coralie's lover wrote tavern catches to buy a grave for her, and Barbet paid for the coffin, of the 4 candles lighted about the dead body, of her who had thrilled a great audience as she stood behind the footlights in her Spanish basquina and scarlet green-clocked stockings, while beyond in the doorway stood the priest who had reconciled the dying actress with God, now about to return to the church to say a mass for the soul of her who had loved much. All the grandeur and the sordid aspects of the scene, all that sorrow crushed under by necessity, froze the blood of the great writer and the great doctor. They sat down. Neither of them could utter a word. Just at that moment a servant in livery announced Mademoiselle des Touches. That beautiful and noble woman understood everything at once. She stepped quickly across the room to Lucien, and slipped 2,000-franc notes into his hand as she grasped it. "It is too late," he said, looking up at her with dull, hopeless eyes. The 3 stayed with Lucien, trying to soothe his despair with comforting words, but every spring seemed to be broken. At noon, all the brotherhood, with the exception of Michel Chrestien, who, however, had learned the truth as to Lucien's treachery, was assembled in the poor little church of the Bonne Nouvelle. Mademoiselle des Touches was present, and Berenice and Coralie's dresser from the theatre, with a couple of supernumeraries, and the disconsolate Camusot. All the men accompanied the actress to her last resting place in Père Lachaise. Camusot, shedding hot tears, had solemnly promised Lucien to buy the grave in perpetuity, and to put a headstone above it with the words, "Coralie, aged 19 years, August 1822. Lucien stayed there, on the sloping ground that looks out over Paris, until the sun had set. "Who will love me now?" he thought. "My truest friends despise me. Whatever I might have done, she who lies there would have thought me wholly noble and good. I have no one left to me now, but my sister and mother and David. And what do they think of me at home?" Poor distinguished provincial! He went back to the Rue de la Lune, but the sight of the rooms was so acutely painful that he could not stay in them, and he took a cheap lodging elsewhere in the same street. Mademoiselle des Touches' 2,000 francs and the sale of the furniture paid the debts. Berenice had 200 francs left, on which they lived for 2 months. Lucien was prostrate. He could neither write nor think. He gave way to morbid grief. Berenice took pity upon him. "Suppose that you were to go back to your own country, how are you to get there?" she asked one day, by way of reply to an exclamation of Lucien's. "On foot." "But even so, you must live and sleep on the way. Even if you walk 12 leagues a day, you will want 20 francs at least." "I will get them together," he said. He took his clothes and his best linen, keeping nothing but strict necessaries, and went to Samanon, who offered 50 francs for his entire wardrobe. In vain he begged the moneylender to let him have enough to pay his fare by the coach. Samanon was inexorable. In a paroxysm of fury, Lucien rushed to Frascati's, staked the proceeds of the sale, and lost every farthing. Back once more in the wretched room in the Rue de la Lune, he asked Berenice for Coralie's shawl. The good girl looked at him, and knew in a moment what he meant to do. He had confessed to his loss at the gaming table, and now he was going to hang himself. "Are you mad, sir? Go out for a walk, and come back again at midnight. I will get the money for you. But keep to the boulevards, do not go towards the quays." Lucien paced up and down the boulevards. He was stupid with grief. He watched the passers-by and the stream of traffic, and felt that he was alone, and a very small atom in this seething whirlpool of Paris, churned by the strife of innumerable interests. His thoughts went back to the banks of his Charente. A craving for happiness and home awoke in him, and with the craving came one of the sudden febrile bursts of energy which half feminine natures like his mistake for strength. He would not give up until he had poured out his heart to David Séchard, and taken counsel of the 3 good angels still left to him on earth. As he lounged along, he caught sight of Berenice in her Sunday clothes, speaking to a stranger at the corner of the Rue de la Lune and the filthy Boulevard Bonne Nouvelle, where she had taken her stand. "What are you doing?" asked Lucien, dismayed by a sudden suspicion. "Here are your 20 francs," said the girl, slipping 4 5-franc pieces into the poet's hand. "They may cost dear yet, but you can go." And she had fled before Lucien could see the way she went. For in justice to him it must be said that the money burned his hand. He wanted to return it, but he was forced to keep it as the final brand set upon him by life in Paris. End of